Good idea. This was definitely a good idea. All right, hey friends. Yeah, it's what do you call it when the caffeine doesn't work anymore and you just have to drink more? That's where I'm at. Hi. I'm your friendly neighborhood YouTuber. And as always, and yes, I really do need to put the super chat theremin on a shelf behind me so you can see me doing the magic hand. It sort of enhances the effect. Welcome, friends. Yes, so, what are we doing here? We're talking about Sarnor and the Silver Sea. Let's make sure the right microphone is working. Yeah, looks good. Sounds good. And, all right, yes, we're rolling. We've got the new computer. If you missed the last live stream, thank you, friends. New computer is here. The video editing is fast. It's delightful, actually. The dragging and dropping in Premiere is great. And, yeah, so I woke up late start, just trying to get going here. But we've got a fun topic. The last few weeks we've been going into the ancient history. We've been talking about Karth and the Five Forts and the Great Empire of the Dawn, migration patterns, and, just all that kind of stuff. Yeah, happy Australia Day to those of you in Australia. We do have a nice little contingent from down under. And, oh gosh, I'm not wearing any sort of, got no flare on. This is terrible. Let me get some flare. Hang on. I don't have 37 pieces of flare, but I got some. Here we go. Here we go. Yes, it's Australia. Yeah, I don't know why my forehead is so shiny today. I'm not sure why. I just feeling bright, I guess. I don't know. It's lighting or something. In any case, yeah, no flare. Exactly. That's no good. So go out and what do you guys do for Australia Day? Does everyone go out? You have to box a kangaroo, right? That's how that works. I get to make cheap Australian jokes now. I have an Australian girlfriend. Woo! So we're going to talk about more ancient stuff today. Yes, ancient stuff. It's lots safer and more fun to speculate about the ancient history of A Song of Ice and Fire than it is the real world. Of course, not quite qualified to, sketch out some alternate history theories about migration patterns. I do love that stuff, though. Not the alternate history, the real history. I've been watching a lot of videos about Proto-European migrations and the peopling of the Americas, and all kinds of good stuff. Let me just check. I just got a little message about stream quality, guys. Let me know if there's any lag or issues with the video or audio. In any case, so I've been diving. I love this stuff in real history. The origins of people is very interesting. It's just one long story of different peoples mixing with other peoples and the culture mixing. From that arises comparative mythology. So if you're into mythology and comparative mythology, it pretty much flows to be interested in Dan Davis. Yes, I have, Paul. Dan Davis, author. So Dan Davis is a guy. I just found him, so I can't speak to his whole thing. But he seems to be someone who's doing historical fiction and then makes videos about some of the areas of research which he's attempting to fictionalize and write stories about. So yeah, I've seen a couple of his videos, and they're really interesting, drilling down into some of the specific groups. Basically, it seems to be a lot of the where a lot of this migrational history comes from is farmers and hunter-gatherers interacting, and also pastoralists who can sort of be in the middle as far as lifestyle goes. And you see in different parts of Europe and Asia and in the Middle East, you see these different groups clashing with each other. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. The Silver Sea is one of the places where it's one of the places where the origins of humanity in this pretend world that we all love so much is said to arise. And the Andals and the First Men are both potentially tied to the Silver Sea area. We've got the Fisher Queens to talk about, as well as the Kingdom of Sarnor. Yeah, Kings and Generals, that's another good one. There's a lot of good YouTube channels. Let me shout out this one YouTube channel that I've found recently. You guys know I am a fan of Graham Hancock. Graham Hancock is kind of my event horizon for like alternate history or pushing against the accepted chronology. I am a big fan of academia. I do like research and study and establish peer review. These are good things. So, you know, Graham, I feel like I enjoy Graham because I don't think Graham oversells himself. And this will get back to A Song of Ice and Fire, so don't worry. You know, it's one thing to say that something, you know, maybe this happened, this is my theory, versus other people be like, yes, Atlantis definitely existed. Like, there's a really terrible YouTube channel out there called Robert Sepper, and he is making all kinds of quack pseudoscience videos about ancient cultures, and there's a lot such channels. I feel comfortable bringing up this guy's name and dissing him because now he's wandered into like some really weird white supremacy, Aryan pseudoscience crap. So that really turns me off and makes me angry. But you know, there's a lot of pseudoscience crap out there. So I found a channel recently that debunking a lot of the stuff you find about just every, you know, I love ancient monuments. I love ancient cultures, but there's a lot of crap out there. There's a lot of garbage research out there. And so there's a channel called World of Antiquity. You can find it on YouTube, World of Antiquity. That's what it's called. It's very easy to look up. And it is a wonderful channel. And he is going around, sometimes it's debunking, sometimes it's just a matter of lots of people say different things about what's the world's oldest civilization. Let's take a look. And he's very academic, goes through all the stuff, and you know, really lays it out. So, for example, the Sphinx. Okay, the Sphinx. Robert Schoch came up with a theory years and years ago that the Sphinx, which is heavily eroded, and of course the Sphinx is carved out of a trench, and the trench that it was carved out of is also eroded. And the erosion looks like rain erosion. It really does, the weathering patterns on the limestone. And so for the last couple decades, it's been an open question about, is the Sphinx older than people think? Because it looks like it got rained on, and it hasn't rained in Egypt in quite a long time. And this is one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for like, the historians got it wrong, and there's really, you know, the Egyptian culture is older than we think, or you know, descended from an older culture who was building high-tech stuff, 10,000 BC and all this stuff. If the Sphinx has 3,000 or 4,000 years of rain erosion, then it's got to be like 10,000 years old. Here's the thing. World of Antiquity did a great video about the age of the Sphinx. And since Robert Schoch has come out with this proposal, again, 25, 30 years ago, I believe it was, a lot of geologists have come tested and researched and tried to verify this, because for the most part, academia is not a conspiracy to hide the magical ancient culture that was really out. Like, there's not a conspiracy. Like, mostly academics are trying to drill down to the truth of things, right? So it turns out that what seems likely with the Sphinx is just that what happened is when it did rain in that part of Egypt, the limestone, which is very porous, allowed the rainwater to seep down into the rock. And so the erosion is from rain, but it happened before the Sphinx was carved. This is what it seems to be the case. Because if you go into the rock of the trench, you can find the cracks and fissures that go back into the rock. So, yes, the Sphinx rock was eroded by rainwater and also by groundwater seeping up, it seems. But that was done before the Sphinx was carved. So the Sphinx is not 10,000 years old, or at least there's no evidence that it is. And in fact, the erosion patterns on the Sphinx body, what look like erosion patterns, is actually a rough carving. The body was never carved to be smooth. It was always carved in that stair-step way because of the different layers of rock. And again, limestone is very porous. The essentially the Sphinx body was always faced with brick, and what we've thought before is that the brick facing on the body was a later addition, and certainly it was repaired many times. But what it seems like they did is they carved the body and they just said, we can't make this body smooth enough because the rock's too porous. And so they then faced it with outer blocks, just like they did the pyramid, which was originally covered in white limestone. So here we are. So like, you can have an idea about something that seems really convincing for a long time, and then it just turns out, okay, well, you've raised a good question, Mr. Robert Schoch, and now we need to go do more testing. And so because Robert Schoch noticed this thing and came up with this theory, we now know a lot more about the Sphinx. But it turns out the Sphinx isn't necessarily 10,000 years old. It's probably approximately when they think it was built. So there you go. Yeah, it sucks in the sense that, like, yeah, I wish everything was a secret conspiracy, and I'm going to write a fantasy novel about pseudo-Atlantis, right? Like, I've definitely romanticized the idea of, ancient cultures and stuff like that. But it's more fun if it's true, right? As far as, like, when we're doing actual research, we can't do historical research chasing after a theory. We've got to at least if we want to, test things out, then if you're going to come up with a theory, then you got to be ready for it to be, tested and hammered. And so that's where we go. That's a little deviation there, but it's going to tie into what we're doing today. So I just wanted to shout out that channel, World of Antiquity. Not nearly enough subscribers compared to some of the videos he's debunking, which have 10 and 100 times the views. And it's pretty bad. And yeah, I can't recommend Survive the Jive anymore. I have recommended them before, but there's way too much white nationalism, weird race supremacy stuff ideas going on with that guy. So I'm not into him anymore. A lot of his research does seem to be pretty good, but I can't recommend that channel. But Robert Sepp here, that one is really absolute trash. Definitely. I mean, you'll see for yourself if you take a look at his channel. It's like quickly goes off into space land, and the logic is very poor. And then, yeah, now he's gone into like white people were actually the masters of all the ancient cultures theory, which is really terrible. And in fact, World of Antiquity debunks that one, which I very much enjoyed. So sorry to sidetrack. That's just what's on my brain lately here. One second. Oh, and my tea is probably steeped. Here, let me pull this tea bag out. Don't want to oversteep the green tea, which I probably already did. Glob the honey in there. So yes, I have been working hard on the... Yeah, Survive the Jive, Jordan, it sneaks up on you because he mostly keeps it out of his videos, but there's a lot of dog whistling in his videos. And then if you go into the comments section, you'll see a lot of ugly stuff come out, and you'll see the guy that runs the channel participate in it. So he's also been to some conferences and gatherings of essentially like white supremacists, like far right types. So he's connected to the sort of alt-right European heritage movement, and it's like way it's creepy stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's fun to learn about history and stuff, but like the thing about the Proto-Indo-European culture, and of course Proto-Indo-European is a sort of conglomerate term for several different nomadic horse riding people in the Asian steppe that essentially spread everywhere from Europe to, of course, Vedic India. And that's why we have all these similar myths and words in cultures all the way from India to Scandinavia. And I've talked about that a bunch in my Chaos Conf live stream that I did. The thing is, though, that all these Proto-European, Indo-Europeans they're horse people. They're not really all that different from like the Dothraki or the Huns or the Mongols. Like that's essentially what we're talking about here. So when you take apart the Proto-Indo-European mythology, it always comes back to like the reality of being a steppe horse riding person. So sometimes there's some pretty funny stuff in there. Also heavily patriarchal, Proto-Indo-European cultures. We, for example, know they had a word for bride price. Okay, so that tells you kind of something about how they viewed women as property, essentially. So a lot of the Proto-Indo-European mythology, it's very sky father, it's very masculine energy. One of the reasons why I'm fascinated with Vedic mythology is because a lot of that got straightened out, particularly with the Kali stuff. You can see some of the indigenous mythology of the Indian continent that mixed with the Aryan, the Proto-Indo-European migrators. Yeah, see, it used to be Aryan invasion theory, and they've disregarded that for Aryan migration theory, which essentially just means that it's more of a gradual migration and mixing of cultures than like one culture riding in and taking over another. Of course, history is full of examples of both. But in India, you can see that the Proto-Indo-European ideas have been changed very heavily as it mixed with the local cultures, both the Harappan peoples and the Dravidian peoples. And Kali, that mythology appears to be native to India and to the Bengal region in particular. And so we see a lot of the crappy patriarchy of like the slaying the sea dragon, the mother dragon goddess, the great like Marduk and Tiamat, for example. We see the feminine represented by the dragon, by chaos, by destruction, and it's the good ordering male storm god who comes in, slays the dragon, and makes the earth from her body. This is part of the chaos comp myth. But then when we look at the whole idea of chaos versus order in the Kali-Shiva relationship, it's much more interesting, a lot less patriarchal. Well, it's not patriarchal at all, really. It's metaphysical. And that's why I love the Kali mythology. I just think it really is the best distillation of order versus chaos. It's the best metaphor to understand order and chaos. And I am very interested in that. I ride that border between chaos and order a lot, being someone with ADHD. As you can tell from the fact that we're 17 minutes in this live stream and we have not talked about Sarnor yet. So hopefully this is interesting. Yeah, it's just what's in my brain and had to get some of it out, I guess. So is there a little bit of lag? Tell me, please give me feedback if there is. It looks on my end, it looks like my CPU is doing good. So there shouldn't be unless my internet connection is slow. Oh, you know what I can do is this. Pause that. Okay. Alrighty, so let's talk about... we're just vibing. That's right. So we're gonna do some reading. I almost did the Reading Rhaegar attire today, but I kind of didn't feel like it. And in fact, let me close down my bottom laptop screen. A little behind the scenes here. Quiet. So here, I like to work like this with my laptop. I promise you I have material. I'm not stalling for time. So I do a little two-tier thing. And so I'm going to shut this lower one down so I can get my giant coffee table size book out in front of me and read it to y'all. We're going to do some reading. There we go. Allow my windows to migrate. Oh, look. Jonathan sending me a PayPal. Thanks. Thank you. Awesome. Appreciate that, Mr. Jonathan. All right. So this kind of is Great Empire of the Dawn adjacent material that we're going to talk about here. It is an open question whether or not there's influence between the Great Empire of the Dawn and the kingdoms of the Silver Sea. But it's not hard to imagine that there was some communication and some contact. So, why did the screen suddenly get so bright? Looks like it's really bright. Oh, well. Very bright. Oh, it's because of this window. There we go. Let me just tuck this behind. Close that. All right. So, folks. Oh, let me get a little more caffeine in my system here. I feel myself starting to wake up. That little discussion woke me up. They got me going here. But I promise it's relevant. It wasn't a total sidetrack. Because the Silver Sea and the Grasslands area is very much a place where we see migrating horse peoples and more sedentary peoples mixing and creating new culture. So we're going to see that George is, at least to some extent, mimicking the way that natural history has unfolded. So beyond the forest of Qohor, friends, Essos opens up upon a vast expanse of windswept plains, gentle rolling hills, fertile river valleys, great blue lakes, and endless steppes where the grass grows as high as a horse's head. From the forest of Qohor in the west to the towering mountains known as the Bones, the grasslands stretch more than 700 leagues. It was here amidst these grasses that civilization was born in the Dawn Age, 10,000 years ago or more, when Westeros was yet a howling wilderness inhabited only by the giants and the children of the forest. The first true towns arose beside the banks of the river Sarn and beside the myriad vassal streams that fed her on the meandering course northward to the shivering sea. The histories of those days are lost to us, sad to say, for the kingdoms of the grass came and went in large measure before the race of man became literate. Only the legends persist. From such we know of the Fisher Queens, who ruled the lands adjoining the Silver Sea, the great inland sea at the heart of the grasslands, from a floating palace that made its way endlessly around its shores. That sounds interesting. Got some high fantasy going on, right? The Fisher Queens were wise and benevolent and favored of the gods, we are told, and the kings and lords and wise men of the world sought the floating palace for their counsel. Beyond their domains, however, other people rose and fell and fought, struggling for a place in the sun. Some maesters believe that the first men originated here before the beginning of their long westward migration that took them across the arm of Dorne to Westeros. The Andals, too, may have arisen in the fertile fields south of the Silver Sea. Tales are told of the Hairy Men, a race of shaggy, savage warriors who rode to battle on unicorns. Though larger than the Ibonese of the present, they may well have been their forebears. We hear as well of the lost city of Liber, where acolytes of a spider goddess and a serpent god fought an endless bloody war. East of them stood the kingdoms of the centaurs, half men and half horse. In the southeast, the proud city-states of the Cathai arose. In the forest to the north, along the shores of the Shivering Sea, were the domains of the Woodswalkers, a diminutive folk, whom many maesters believe to have been kin to the children of the forest, and between them could be found the hill kingdoms of the Cimeri, the long-legged gyps with their wicker shields and lime-stiffened hair, and the brown-skinned, pale-haired Zokora, who rode to war in chariots. So it says, most of these peoples are gone now, their cities burned and buried, their gods and heroes all but forgotten. Of the Cathai cities, only Karth remains, dreaming of past glories beside the jealously guarded jade gates which link the summer and jade seas. The others were extinguished, driven into exile, or conquered and assimilated by the people who succeeded them. And then it's going to transition into Sarnor. So before we get to Sarnor, we're going to talk about this mythical past of the Silver Sea. And it also says here in a sidebar, sufficient tales survive to convince most maesters of the past existence of the Silver Sea, though because of the diminishing rainfall over the centuries, it has shrunk so severely that today only 3 great lakes remain where once its waters glistened in the sun. So let's take a look. I've got maps. Oh, yes. Oh, you know what I'm going to need to do since I've closed my laptop is plug in my little extra keyboard. Yes. So let's pull up the big map. And, oh, open system, yes. Yes, I give it permission to capture the screen. Just upgraded my computer. Everything needs permissions again. Oh, never mind. Okay, sorry guys. It's, oh, is it working? It is working. It just told me that I needed to quit my program and restart my computer to get it to work. But that is wrong because it is working and I cannot restart my computer. So that's good. So here we have the Dothraki Sea, right? We've got from the bones to the forests of Qohor. This is the area we're talking about. So we can see that when we talk about the cities of the Cathai, we mentioned that in the Karth stream. There's several ruined cities in the Red Waste. Potentially they might have a connection with the Lazar, or even the native people that gave rise, the ancestors of the Valerians. Because the Cathai are tall and pale. They're called the milkmen because they have such pale skin. The Valerians obviously very pale. The Valerians, the original Valerians were shepherds. And so are the Lazarene. Okay, the Lazarene look more like the Dothraki, but they are shepherds, and so are the ancient Valerians. So you have to wonder, you go back in time, there probably was a common ancestor between all of these people. The pale Cathai, the pale Valerians, and then these two shepherd cultures. Maybe they didn't have genetic exchange. Probably it looks like, the Lazarene seem to be more related to the Dothraki and the Sarnor, people of Sarnor, who are all similarly colored and have similar culture in some ways. But yeah, the Valerian-Carthene connection is one I've worried about because they are, like I said, both tall and pale and not too far away from each other here. And we know the whole thing about the Proto-Indo-Europeans is because they were horse peoples, that's why they spread. That's why their culture was so influential. It's because if you don't have horses, you just can't go as far, like distance-wise in life. You can't range as far. And so we've seen that anytime a great horse culture arises, like the Mongols are the most famous, they can use the plains as a highway. And so we saw the Mongols, they were able to threaten all the way into Europe until they ran into natural land barriers, because there's just a nice smooth grass highway all the way from the Asian steppe into Europe. I think that's what George is recreating here. So once the Dothraki became strong after the fall of Valyria, that's why they rule this entire huge area. It's because they can move around it very fast on horseback. So that is why the Proto-Indo-European peoples were so influential. And so that's why I'm looking at this area and seeing diaspora. That's what's being suggested with the Silver Sea. You know, the Andals, the First Men, the Cathai, all these different people originated near the Silver Sea. So where was the Silver Sea? It says that now there's only 3 lakes left. And you can see there's 2 lakes here in the Kingdom of Sarnor, right? This is Sarnor, this big river. This is the river Sarn. It starts at Morosh and flows down through the Essen Sarnor and then bends around to what used to be Sarnath here. Now these 2 lakes, these are obviously 2 of the 3 lakes that are a remnant of the Silver Sea. The 3rd lake, well, for a while we thought maybe it was the womb of the world and that the Silver Sea was that big that it stretched all the way from the lakes of Sarnor to the womb of the world. This is not the case, however. This has been clarified. And so let me pull up this other map that I downloaded. This is the results of an error. The map maker on this map did not have the right notes. There are supposed to be 3. Hang on here. Where is that bloody map? I swore. Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay, so on this one, and this is the HBO map, but this was made from George's notes. And George has said that this is how it's supposed to look. So let me zoom in here. As my very noisy neighbors walk outside. I've got to make a lot of noise anytime they do anything. So here you can see the 3 lakes. So now you can get an idea for how big the Silver Sea was. What happened was when George wrote in the Kingdom of Sarnor, he accidentally wrote over part of the river. And so the map maker then sort of did his best with what he could see there and only ended up putting 2 lakes instead of 3. But this is how it's supposed to be. Bum bum. Mystery solved. And in fact, oh, here's a better map. I'll show you this one. I don't know why it's giving you my whole computer instead of just the... Oh, well, whatever. So you can see, George pictured them kind of like the Egyptians, meaning all of their cities are built along one river that connects to these lakes. So it used to be the Silver Sea connecting these 3 lakes. And so all the cities here, Salash, Gornath, Sathar, and possibly even Kasath, would have been on the shores of the Silver Sea. So, there you go. The womb on this map, well, it's not going to be on that map. I would have, on the map I just had up, it would have been on there. But it's all the way over here. The womb of the world is closer to the mountains. Now, I don't want to go over the Dothraki stuff again in too great detail because I talked about it in the Karth live stream, and there's also the origins of the Dothraki stream. But the Dothraki have memory of coming over the Bones Mountains. We also find nomadic horse people, the Jogosnai over here, except for they have Zorses. So obviously there's a common ancestor. However, when the ancestors of the Dothraki came over the mountains, they must have found horses over here. They also seem to have intermarried with the ancestors of the Kingdom of Sarnor. The Sarnor people are called the Tall Men, and they have very similar coloring to the Dothraki with black eyes and hair, sort of golden brown skin. They're very tall. They're also very good with horses. They just use them in chariots because they're a farming people versus a nomadic horse people like the Dothraki. So pretty obvious that the Dothraki were, and it says in the Land of Ice and Fire, not Land of Ice and Fire, the World of Ice and Fire, that the ancestors of the Dothraki were essentially steppe people lingering on the steppes of the Bones until Valyria basically fell apart, and then they mobilized and struck back against Sarnor, their sort of highfalutin cousins, and Sarnor had grown complacent and was unready for the Dothraki, it seems. But we'll get there. So let's go back to the Silver Sea and the Fisher Queens. So first of all, we can decode some of the mythology here. Let me put myself back on the screen. We can decode some of the mythology here. Like, for example, the Maesters themselves suggest that Arthmaester Hagedorn has put forth the theory that the centaurs were no more than mounted warriors, as perceived by neighboring tribes who had not yet learned to tame and ride horses. His views have become more widely accepted at the Citadel, despite the purported centaur skeletons that turn up in grotesqueries from time to time. So, are there centaurs? I don't know. We've never seen any. However, Lyanna and Brandon Stark, who are very good horse riders, they are called half centaur, which is confusing since centaurs are already half human and half horse. So if you're half centaur, someone draw me a picture of how that works. But point is, the idea of a centaur has already been used by George to associate horseback riding, people that are expert horseback riders who may be skin changers. That's what I'm trying to say. Leanna and Brandon almost certainly have the latent skin changer gift that flowered in all of the Stark kids who were born with direwolves. Not born with direwolves, but who were, who found the direwolves when they were very young, which seems to have activated and awakened their gifts. So I guess I'll go ahead and give you my quick version of the Dothraki skin changer theory. It's relevant here. So the Ifakevron, and I'm going to go back to the screen share. Ifakevron are in this forest here. They're very clearly children of the forest. The sea snake went there, and he wrote of carved trees. And then the description of the Ifakevron matches the children. They're called the Woods Walkers. So the interesting thing is that the Dothraki have always revered the Ifakevron. They consider them sacred. And when the hairy men, who seem to be Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons or something like that, when they went to war against the Ifakevron, the Dothraki took it out on them and warred against them. So the Dothraki, because you can see that Ibish is right here. Ibsar, Port of Ibn. So basically the hairy men of Ib, they tried to create a settlement here on the peninsula, and the Dothraki destroyed it. We're going to read about that, actually. But I do suspect that... Okay, let me go get Cleo. Hang on. Goose was taking a bath in his water bowl. That was upsetting Cleo. Poor girl. Oh, I'm sorry. You okay, girl? Oh, yeah. Goose was splashing. Okay. So we've got these children of the forest types, or just straight up children of the forest, in the forest of the Ifakevron. Okay. The Dothraki consider them sacred. They revere them, and they warred against the hairy men when they killed them. So then this idea that, there's centaurs in the east of the Silver Sea. Well, that's where the ancestors of the Dothraki would be. In the steppes of the Bones Mountains here. That's it. That's what we're talking. So those weren't centaurs in the east. Those would have been the ancestors of the Dothraki, who would have been some of the first horse riders to be seen in that area. And furthermore, we see that the Dothraki maintain a custom of a very sacred bond between man and horse. It's supposedly even more sacred than the marriage bond. It's pretty gross, obviously, but it's probably a remnant of a time when the Dothraki skin changed their horses. This is what I think is to be the case. If there were children of the forest there, like the Dothraki worshipping the Ifakevron, that's the same as the first men worshipping the children of the forest. Something about the magical power of the children and the Ifakevron has impressed certain humans who have come to worship them. But we know in Westeros, the humans that worship the children of the forest, the first men, many of them were skin changers and green seers. So you can see that this worship and this cultural exchange almost certainly involves intermarrying as well. Genetic mingling. So it makes sense that the ancestors of the Dothraki who worship the Ifakevron, probably some of them would have been skin changers. And this is why the Dothraki have this sacred bond between man and horse. Nobody can ride somebody else's horse. That's just a skin changer rule passed down through time long after people are actually skin changing the horses, right? Because that's how it is with skin changers. You can't share animals. You can steal them, but you can't share them. Come here, girl. Definitely not going to climb on the off-stream. So I went into that in more detail in the Origins of the Dothraki video. But when Mirri Maz Duur does her weird magic ritual with Drogo that leaves him a vegetable, this seems like a botched Skinchanger resurrection ceremony. She's got Drogo and his horse. Drogo is in a comatose-like state near death. If he were a Skinchanger, his spirit would have probably gone into his animal by now. Potentially could have, if he's unconscious. Much like Jon being dead and his spirit being in Ghost. Then Mirri Maz Duur kills the horse and says, strength of the horse go into the rider. So if this were a Jon scenario, you'd be sacrificing Ghost and saying, spirit of the rider, go back into the rider. Okay? The spirit of the horse or the wolf, in this case, would be the Skinchanger and the animal. So then she, like I said, cuts the horse's throat, says, spirit of the horse, go into the rider, strength of the horse, go into the man, whatever. And then Drogo is not resurrected because he's not a Skinchanger and his spirit wasn't in his horse. And so he got turned into a vegetable. So the idea is that Mirri might have used a Skinchanger resurrection spell, knowing that it would leave Drogo a vegetable because he wasn't a Skinchanger. Possibly. I don't know it's hard to say what exactly Mirri was doing, but this is one theory that I have about that. So we've got centaurs, those are horse people. We've got the Cathai. And what about this idea that the first men and the Andals may have arisen here? Well, the first men have to arise from somewhere. They just sort of appear on history crossing the Arm of Dorne here. So where are they from? Well, there's definitely, if you look at the culture of Norvos, it seems a little first man-like. A lot of bear stuff going on, axe cult, blood sacrifice. So when you look at Norvos and Qohor both, I definitely think these could be George writing them as common ancestor with the first men, but a long friggin' time ago, right? And both the Andals and the first men are very fair. Now, of course, in the real world, the gene for light skin has evolved in several different places, which is one of the reasons why Caucasian is no longer considered a race. It's because it's not. it's a pigmental adaptation from people living at high altitudes, and it's happened in several places. Actually, I just watched a video about that. So when we look at the Andals and the First Men, they don't necessarily have to have a common ancestor. Same thing with the Pale Valerians and the Pale Carthian. They don't have to have a common ancestor, but they might. They definitely might. And in the case of the Norvos culture, it really does feel like split development with those of the First Men. So if the First Men are arising somewhere in Essos, if they cross the Arm of Dorne, and potentially they could have common ancestors here in Norvos and Andalos, well, they're not from Valeria, so you kind of keep going here, and this is where you get to. You get to the Silver Sea and the Kingdom of Sarnor. Or not the Kingdom of Sarnor, but the area here. So yeah, it could be. It's not really enough evidence to say for sure, but I think George wants to suggest it just to sort of give us this idea that, like, as far back as you want to go in history, there's always going to be another step back further. There's always going to be people that came before. We tend to think about cultures as being, you know, almost like having as much personal identity as like separate people. Like you, like I'm David and you have a different name. Like, but the thing is that culture is, it's never sealed in a hermetic chamber, very rarely. There are, one of the only examples of that would be like the Aboriginal Australians who migrated into Australia. Again, shout out to you guys, Australia Day. Migrated into Australia 60,000 BC, and then as the sea levels went up, they were then cut off from Asia, because they used to be able to walk all the way into Australia. And they did 60,000 years ago. But once the waters rose, they were essentially cut off from everyone else. So their culture has been isolated for that long. And that's why I just watched a cool video about this. We can find legends among the Aboriginal Australians of the sea level rise going back 10 and 12,000 years ago. They have specific place legends of islands being cut off from the mainland and things like that that have been verified by science. So little side branch there. But for the most part, cultures are constantly evolving, constantly shifting. That's reflected in language. Like language, nobody ever comes up with a language. They just mutate. They arise over time and they gradually blend into others. And when cultures combine, they borrow words from each other and new things arise. And so when we look back at where did the first men come from? Well, somewhere in Essos. Maybe in, near the Arm of Dorn, maybe near the Silver Sea. It's hard to say because as time goes, all of these cultures are flowing into one another and mixing. And by the time, so for example, when the first men, quote unquote, crossed into Westeros, this was a gradual migration. It wasn't like one event. It wasn't one migration. It was a gradual migration over centuries and centuries. And that's how it works usually in the real world too. Like I just told you, the Aborigines walked into Australia, right? Well, they left Africa about 70,000 years ago. It took them about 10,000 years to get to Australia. So were they just walking for 10,000 years? No, they built a town. And then the next generation went a little further. And then that town built up for a couple generations. And then it got too big. And the second son of the chieftain was like, oh, I'm going to go start my own town. And then he went and started a town. And then over the course of 10,000 years, you get from Africa to the Middle East along the south coast of India and then all the way into Australia. So similarly, the first men, the various tribes and peoples that eventually got unified into the group that we consider the first men, would have originally been scattered and spread out. It would have been various peoples. It's hard to say. But George is very skillfully recreating the fog of history here, where the further we go back, the less we know, and the more mythicized things get. So now let's talk about the Fisher Queens. There wasn't much about the Fisher Queens. It's literally like a paragraph. It says, they ruled the lands adjoining the Silver Sea from a floating palace that made its way endlessly around its shores. So definitely high fantasy here. We should consider this to be somewhat mythical. They were wise and benevolent and favored of the gods. So sort of lost golden age. Everything was hunky-dory kind of a thing. But beyond their domains, people rose and fell. And then we're going to hear about, let's see. We're never told about the downfall of the Fisher Queens or how that happened. So here's what it says. Most of those peoples are gone now. Their cities burned and buried. Their gods and heroes all but forgotten. Of the Cathai, only Karth remains. The others were extinguished, driven into exile, or conquered and assimilated by the people who succeeded them. Westeros remembers their conquerors as the Sarnori, for at its height their great kingdom included all the lands watered by the Sarn and its vassals, and the 3 great lakes that were all that remained of the shrinking Silver Sea. They called themselves the Tall Men. Long of limb and brown of skin they were, like the Zokora, though their hair and eyes were black as night, because the Zokora had pale hair. Warriors, sorcerers, and scholars, they traced their descent to the hero king they called Huzhor Amai, the Amazing, born of the last of the Fisher Queens, who took to wife the daughters of the greatest lords and kings of the Gyps, the Cimeri, and the Zokora, binding all 3 peoples to his rule. His Zokora wife drove his chariot, it is said. His Cimer wife made his armor, for her people were the first to work iron, and he wore about his shoulders a great cloak made from the pelt of a king of the hairy men. So this is really good stuff here. Huzhor Amai, the Amazing. This is a very mythical character, but the point is that he is you can see the purpose of his legend. The purpose of his legend serves to give the Sarnori legitimacy over all the people of the grasslands. And they did this by saying, actually, we Sarnori are a fusion of the three greatest people of that time, the Gyps, the Zokora, and the Sumeri. And so when it's like, oh, Huzhor Amai, he took 3 wives, and each of his wives gave him this thing from their culture. This is a cultural myth. Like, these wives are the cultures. Basically, they're saying, the Zokora wife drove his chariot. Well, that means the Zokora were the ones who made the chariots. The Cymer wife made his armor, for her people were the first to work iron. So this is a reference to the Sumerians from Conan or whatever. But essentially, these are one of the first people to make iron and steel. And George has given us a couple possibilities for the first to make iron, quote unquote. But that's also how it is in the real world, where it popped up in a few different places. We just found Viking iron that dates back to like 200 BC. They were forging primitive steel up there long before, the Damascus steel made its way up there. Although the original Damascus steel making process still predates that one a little bit. But the point is, we're discovering new things all the time that push things back. And just like originally we thought, oh, farming was invented in one place. Well, no, it was invented in 6 different places. So metalworking is a similar thing. And in fact, the hunter-gatherers in Scandinavia who were making iron back in 200 BCE weren't even farmers. They were nomadic people, which is another one where it upended something we used to think that only sedentary people do things like build monuments and forge iron. But no, that's not true. Göbekli Tepe seems to have been built by hunter-gatherers who were only at the very beginning of making a transition into farming. And that, in fact, it may have been gathering to make monuments that led to people noticing seeds and farming and stuff. Although that's all in debate, because we can find, before farming, quote unquote, exists, there are people sort of kind of farming, planned gathering. It's a long road, but it's mostly in the Levant and Mesopotamia. So in any case, I feel like we're spending half the time in the real world today and half of it in the fake world, but that's okay. That's kind of the point of this channel. So Huzhor Amai, whoever he was, probably nobody, he represents a fusion of the local peoples to give rise to this Kingdom of Sarnor. So very like Dany putting on her floppy ears, in order for the Sarnori to have legitimacy, they've got to say, oh no, all 3 people contributed. And we're also, he was the last son of the Fisher Queens? Is that what it was? So he's also tying his legitimacy back to their mythical beginnings. The Fisher Queens would have been seen as like the ancestors of all of these people, so this is a total legitimization myth for the Sarnori. And then a great cloak made from the pelt of a king of the hairy men. This also signifies dominion. The hairy men are basically, they make for an easy antagonist, right? They're hairy, they're kind of monstrous, they're obviously some sort of Neanderthal type of thing. So they're not, we're still trying to figure out how smart, quote unquote, Neanderthals were. Turns out smarter than we thought, of course. That's usually how the research goes. And just the fact that humans have interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans and various other archaic human forms shows you that there was enough commonality for that to happen. So George has given his hairy men a fair amount of culture, right? They build cities and they go to war with people. This could be close to historically accurate. We don't, it's hard to say how the mixing of archaic humans and early hunter-gatherers went in Europe around 40,000 years ago, but we're starting to learn a little bit about it. And obviously there was enough interbreeding for, a lot of people to carry as much as 2 to 3 or even 5% Neanderthal blood types. or Denisovan if you're from Southeast Asia. So let's see. Am I missing any questions here? I've not seen. Let's see, what did Austin say? So yeah, okay, Hugo. I'll get to the Hugo and the Huzhor thing, yeah, for sure. But I want to start with the Fisher Queens. So the term Fisher Queen, obviously Huzhor Amai sounds a little like Azor Ahai too. So we'll get there. The Fisher Queens. It's an interesting title because, of course, the Fisher King is a very well-known mythical archetype. You don't like the Fisher King? They're queen. We're talking about queens, girl. I know. Down with the patriarchy. I know. Come here, girl. Come here. No, they're vacuuming upstairs. They apparently have a very old vacuum, which like is constantly eating the carpet or something. I don't know. What's people upstairs, man. What was I saying? Oh yeah. Well, so just that. I'm gonna Fisher Queens. Just real quick to follow up on the hairy man thing. Huzhor Amai wearing a pelt of the hairy man. It just says, I'm the conqueror of the hairy men. I am the civilizer. The hairy men are unruly and monstrous, and I have defeated them and civilized them. And that's obviously the kind of figure that Huzhor Amai is. He's a cultural founder. So that all makes sense. So the Fisher King, the idea of the Fisher King, it's the same as the Grail King. It's basically the concept that the king represents the land. The health of the king mirrors the land. If the king is sick, the land is sick, and vice versa. And this is very much a Proto-Indo-European idea. It goes back to the idea that it's just, the duty of the king, actually, shout out to Daenerys, is to essentially be willing to sacrifice themselves for the people. The original myth of the hero twins, which is also related to the Chaos Kampf myth. There's two twins. One of them is slain by the other, and from the body parts of the slain twin, the world is made. Eventually, this got mixed with some of the Dragon Slayer myths, where the dragon is slain, and from the slain dragon, the world is made. In Norse myth, it's the giant Ymir who is slain. But this idea comes from the idea it's a noble sacrifice. And so the first king then honors the tradition of the slain person, essentially, whose sacrifice created the world. And so the duty of the king is potentially to be willing to be sacrificed. And so we see that in the Pentos legend, right? The tattered prince was somebody who was supposed to be sacrificed for the sake of the city, who didn't want to go along with the plan and ran away, which you can't blame him. But that's George using Fisher King mythology, essentially. And so, like I said, Proto-Indo-European, very male-dominated culture. So the high goddess, the sky father, primogeniture, male-led household, all that stuff. So the Fisher King, it's very interesting that George has flipped it around to the Fisher Queen. So instead, we're definitely supposed to understand this is a matriarchal culture. And now we have the queen that essentially would symbolize the health of the land. So she's a Fisher Queen, and her city is floating on the Silver Sea. So it's a very aquatic type of myth. And of course, that's a pretty old mythological thing to associate bodies of water with femininity without getting, too far into that, because it gets kind of weird. A lot of times the masculine and feminine principles in esoteric or metaphysical conversations should be understood less as a gender thing and more of as just like a binary type of yin and yang type of energy. And so I think that when we talk about the Fisher King or the Fisher Queen, ultimately it's showing you that the monarch and the land, the monarch is a symbol of the land. So Fisher Queen, she's called a Fisher Queen and she lives on a floating city. So it's kind of interesting. It's a very aquatic based myth. And to be honest, Nimble Dick wanted to host this stream. He wanted to sow some conspiracy theories about squishers and stuff, but I told him that, he got a pretty good run on the Nimbledick squisher hunt, and he would have to wait for another chance. Because here's the thing. The word Sarnath comes from Lovecraft. Shout out to Grey Waste Tim and the 5/4 stream from last week. The Doom That Came to Sarnath is a short story from Lovecraft. And essentially what happens in it is that Sarnath is a great city. They're full of hubris. And I think they massacre like frog people or something that are living in the land before them. And they live happily for a long time. But then one night, spirits of the frog people come out of the lake and basically kill everyone. And then no one can live there anymore, and it's cursed. So it's this sudden doom-like event. And I've read it a long time ago, so forgive me for the loose summary. But the point is, Sarnath is wiped out by a bunch of squishers whose ancestors they massacred. So I don't know I don't know what connection that has to Sarnor, except for that, of course, Sarnor is a civilization that lives by a big lake, just as Sarnath was in Lovecraft. And, of course, for the Sarnori, they were wiped out not in a single day, but very suddenly by the Dothraki. So I guess if we're to carry that analogy back, perhaps it is that the Sarnor used to war with the ancestors of the Dothraki. And that makes sense to me because, like I said, they probably have a common ancestor. So at one point, there was a cultural split between the horse people who became farmers, became city builders, and those that stayed nomadic on the steppes. Oh, Grey Waste Tim, did you have a PayPal? You said I answered it without knowing. Oh, Sarnath, right. So Sarnath warred against the men of Ib and stole their idol. Oh, yeah, that's right. They stole the idol, and the idol is cursed and channels essentially the revenge. But the men of Ib aren't this. They're not hairy men in that story. So Grey Waste Tim, if you want to put a little more detail in the chat here and correct anything I have said, or that you think, what's the parallel here? That's my question, is why? Because there's not, Sarnor, the Kingdom of Sarnor is not very Lovecraftian, and the Dothraki aren't very Lovecraftian either. So what would George be saying by creating this parallel? Yeah, so Sarnath wars against the Squishers of Ib, right? That's what I was remembering. Steal their idol of the water lizard king god, Bokrug. Let's give him some dignity. Yeah, there you go. So the Fisher Queen, like I said, George has taken the Fisher King concept and flipped it around. That is interesting. A lot of the cultures that the Proto-Indo-European horse peoples conquered or assimilated with were in fact matriarchal cultures. Matriarchal cultures were a lot more common in ancient times, going back 2000, 3000 BC. And in particular, a lot of the cultures of the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean, not the Mesopotamia, sorry, not Mediterranean, the Mesopotamia, were more matriarchal. And so that is where this dragon slayer myth probably comes from. When we reconstruct the original Proto-Indo-European form of the dragon slayer myth, it appears to be something about cattle stealing, where a three-headed serpent steals cattle and takes them to a cave. And the hero, who is the storm god or the servant of the storm god, one or the other, your Indra figure, if you will, he goes and, or Marduk, I guess, yeah, Indra or Marduk character, he goes and slays the three-headed dragon and brings the cattle back. So later, this turned into more of an aquatic thing where it's a sea dragon that gets slain. Like I said, it merged with the myth of slaying the twin. But the dragons and serpents generally in the classic world were associated with feminine energy, with women. And so similarly, the women are associated with chaos by these Proto-Indo-European folks. And so we see this sort of male-dominated view of this mythology where they're slaying a three-headed dragon. This basically represents a cultural clash, saying our culture is defeating their culture. Our god can kick your god's ass. This is super common. We see it all over history. I talked about it a lot with the Canaanites and the Garden of Eden myth, because the whole point of Eve and the tree is that this is a version of Asherah, who is a goddess associated with a sacred garden and a sacred tree and a serpent. And so the Genesis myth is actually written as a polemic, meaning don't worship the tree goddess, she's evil. And actually God owns the tree and the snake is the devil. It basically takes apart the Asherah myth and rewrites it to give power to the male god. So this is, and that's not something that like the Bible is unique again. This happened all over the place in ancient cultures where they would create myths that acknowledged the gods of the neighboring peoples and show them as being defeated in their own stories. And so this is the three-headed dragon, the three-headed serpent from Proto-Indo-European myth, basically represents not only femininity or matriarchal cultures or chaos, the idea of chaos associated with women, but also specifically the Mesopotamian cultures that they were rubbing up against to the south. And so George seems to be showing a similar thing where the Sarnori are male-dominated society, as are the Dothraki, both horse peoples. They have conquered a previous civilization which was matriarchal, the Fisher Queens of the Silver Sea. So I think by calling it Fisher Queen and taking the normal Fisher King thing and inverting it, he's sort of calling attention to the gender change. He's calling our attention to it and saying, yeah, usually we have Fisher Queens or Fisher Kings, but this is a Fisher Queen. So it's very interesting. She becomes, you know, something of a goddess queen figure. You know, she's part sea goddess, part mermaid, and part queen. And so we're told all of the other kings and chiefs of the world, they came to appeal to her, to listen to her wisdom. So she's kind of like the mythology of Garth the Green in Westeros, the high king of all the other kings. That's how the Fisher Queen is depicted. Oh, look, it's 4:20. 1 second. Let me put that map back up on the screen. Oh, that's a good looking map there. Real quick, I want to thank everyone for watching who's clicked the like button. I barely have to. Oh, Mark Daniel. Yes, I will get the trippy song happening again. Sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah, totally. I was using that as my interlude music. Yeah, tons of people liking the stream. I don't even have to ask you guys to do it anymore. You're so well trained. Also, the comments have been great lately. Yeah. No, the bird does not smoke. Also, I have to keep a window open and ventilation happening. I'm a big fan of fans. There's always fans in my house. Air purifiers and fans and things like that. I don't like to live in a smoky house, so. Also, birds they have delicate lungs, so they you don't want to give them secondhand smoke, no. So, yeah, don't worry. I take care of all that stuff. So where were we? So Fisher Queens. It's okay, girl. I just picked up the book. It's just a book. It's okay. Hey. With the tail. With the tail, girl. So, okay. Huzhor Amai. Obviously, the name is very similar to Azor Ahai, right? It's very similar. So this opens up the question of, did the name Azor Ahai make it over the mountains somehow? Now, we are told that the myth of Azor Ahai, which is tied to Ashai, of course, in the further east, there are 5 different legends and 5 names for Azor Ahai, and possibly more, but 5 that we're told about. He's sometimes called Hyrkoon the Hero by the people of the former empire of Hyrkoon, which is where that great sand sea exists now. And of course, by Yasabad, Samiriana, and Kaya, the 3 cities that guard the passes in the Bones Mountains, are all that's left of the kingdom of Hyrkoon. So the kingdom of Hyrkoon, they probably sprung up right after the great empire of the Dawn disintegrated 8,000, 10,000 years ago, and has since gone the way of the dodo. And they're gone now. But the fact that they have a Azor Ahai legend probably means they were existent right after that long night, when that legend would have been the thing that people were telling. Yi has an Azor Ahai hero called Yintar. Up in the north, you see that little place called Nefer. They have Neferion. So we can see that the Azor Ahai myth is spread all through the lands of the great empire of the Dawn, all the way from Ashai to Yi to Hyrkoon to Nefer. So that's from one sea to the other. So this common legend, and this is one of the things that tells us this great empire of the Dawn was a real thing, because there's a cultural dispersal of a common myth across this entire area. So they probably had a common ancestor. So the idea that just over the mountains we'd find another version of this hero, but one that's more distant, kind of makes sense, right? Huzhor Amai, he doesn't have a flaming sword, and he's not associated with the Long Night. Not directly. But the name is suggestive. So, there's a couple theories I have come up with about this. One, we know that people did flee the great empire of the Dawn over the Bones. We know that because we're told that it happened both on the from the side of the great empire and from the Dothraki. The Dothraki remember coming over the mountains, and in the east they have memories of everyone fleeing and going different ways. So they would have fled along the coast, and some of them would have come to Karth, which is why Karth seems to have so much, great empire of the Dawn mystique about it. Thank you, Garth's Burning Bush. Just leave that up for a second. And, you have activated the Super Chat Theremin, and so did Grey Waste Tim. Sorry, Grey Waste Tim. That was for Grey Waste Tim. And this is for you, Jonathan. All right. Now we're all caught up. So, where was I? Sorry, the ADD is especially bad today, if you can't tell. Oh, yes, Huzhor Amai, Azor Ahai. So, picture it if you can. Great Empire of the Dawn is breaking up. The Long Night has ravaged the world. It's been 10, 12 years of darkness. All of the empire, the great empire has fallen into ruins. The local governors and kings have lost their authority. All is chaos, anarchy, war, starvation, etc. Then, somehow it ends. And the survivors are like, thank God, that sucked. Now we've got to rebuild towns or build new towns. And we see that in Yi, every city is built upon 3 older ruins. So we see that. We see that in Yi, they just built over some of the older stuff. But other people fled. So the people that fled over the mountains, they would have been carrying with them the very recent cultural memory of all of the Long Night events. And we see that the Dothraki, they have a very strong taboo against blood magic, right? Look how they freak out when the Magi from Ashai starts talking about blood magic. Like, they're against the Magi from the beginning. And when she starts talking about doing sorcery to raise Drogo, they're just putting up like the sign of the cross, like, no, 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 no. That's evil. So this memory could certainly be from the memory of the murder of the Amethyst Empress by the Bloodstone Emperor, which supposedly caused the Long Night. So it's possible that this name Azor Ahai, which is associated with, again, the hero, of course, who ended the Long Night, despite all of my heretical headcanon about maybe he was actually the bad guy, the name Azor Ahai is remembered as a hero figure. So it could be that Azor Ahai, more than a name, is or became a title. So it could be that Huzhor Amai, if he was a real person, he could be wearing a mutated version of that title. Azor Ahai, that might mean King of Kings, the Great Khan, something like that, right? Son of God, who knows? It could mean something along those lines. Dragon God, descendant of the God Emperor. It could very much be a title. And so as time, distance, cultural migration happening, eventually that Azor Ahai word becomes Huzhor Amai. That would perfectly mimic essentially what we know about Proto-Indo-European. The whole reason why we can reconstruct Proto-Indo-European, which was a language spoken by people on the steppe in 6000 BC, is because it spread in so many different directions that we can take all of these, like, for example, the word that most people use as a go-to example is the word for sky father. Zeus and Jupiter, both of those words come from Deus Pater, or something along those lines. You see the word Dios or Deus, Deus, Zeus, and then Pater means father, so it's sky father. Pater becomes also Tyr and Thor. So these linguistics is a very interesting science. I don't need to explain linguistics to you. You guys know how it works. Basically, that's it. So when we look at Huzhor Amai, this could definitely be a phonetic variant of Azor Ahai, no doubt. Could be. We know that people came over the mountains, so maybe they took that title with them. The other thing is that if, let's say, Huzhor Amai is just a total myth that the Sarnori made up to legitimize themselves, kind of like Moses, to be honest. Moses, probably there's no evidence that Moses ever existed or that the Israelites were ever enslaved in Egypt. That probably did not happen. And in fact, the Egyptians were ruling over the Levant in the time period right before most of the Bible was written. And it's likely that that is where the Egyptians sort of became oppressors in sort of biblical history. Because what they were really writing about was the Babylonian captivity. And by creating a mythical previous captivity, they were sort of providing a story to give hope to the Israelites who were in captivity in Babylon to say, oh no, it's okay, we overcame this before, we can do this again. But there's no evidence that Moses lived or that the Egyptians ever had the Israelites captive in Egypt. So the Moses figure is created as a founding myth for their culture. That is the point of that myth. And whether or not he was real or not, he can still become mythicized. Like George Washington is functionally a myth at this point. Abraham Lincoln, the founding fathers of America, most of what we think about them is myth. It is either barely based on truth or not true at all, or it represents a broader cultural sentiment that then becomes ascribed to one person. So that's kind of how we're supposed to see Huzhor Amai. Maybe he was a real person, maybe not, but he represents something. He represents essentially the founding of the Kingdom of Sarnor. And that's why I say he's a tale that gives legitimacy. He conquered the hairy men. He's descendant of the Fisher Queens. He took a wife from the three major peoples and unified their skills and created the great Kingdom of Sarnor from them all. And the thing is, the Kingdom of Sarnor is great. And it is very likely that is essentially what happened, that it was the result of several cultures that all had different things mingling to the point where they became unified. And there probably was a figure at some point who fought wars of unification or who just came to dominate the area to give rise to the Kingdom of Sarnor. But moon meteors. Put the camera on me. We know moon meteors are a thing, or at least we think so. And whether or not moon meteors are a thing, we know the long night is a thing. Okay, the long night transformed the world. It is a weather event. The sun stopped shining for years. This would lead to lowering of temperatures, ocean currents destabilizing. I think the Arm of Dorn breaking is a long night event, which is also going to change the ocean currents. So essentially, the world that existed before the long night is not going to be the same world that emerges after the long night. And so when we go from the Silver Sea and the Kingdom of the Fisher Queens, and then somehow there's 3 lakes and the Sarnori rise up. And to me, probably the thing that was step 2, the mysterious phase 2, to shout out the Underpants Gnomes, was the long night. Because like I said, the long night is such a disaster that it would have destabilized every power base in existence. Anybody who claimed kingship or authority or queenship or anything like that, they would have lost their power. All organized governments would have fallen. And not only that, this is probably the beginning of the shrinking of the Silver Sea, the destabilization of the climate that eventually led to the drier times. And we talked about that on the Grey Waste Tim stream as well. Everything's drying up in the east also. So it's probably the case that the Fisher Queens are Dawn Age, meaning before the long night. And that after the long night is when the Sarnori arose. And that's approximately the chronology that we have. The Sarnori are implied as being as old as Valyria. And, concurrent with Valyria. So they are one of the first civilizations that would have risen up just after the Long Night disaster. And that's what I've said about Westeros too, that the Age of Heroes, most of the Age of Heroes stuff is going to come right after the Long Night. Okay, because any houses that still exist, like Lannister, Stark, Gardner up until 300 years ago, if they can trace their authority back centuries and even thousands of years, that's not a train of power that would have existed, that would have had continuity through the Long Night. The Long Night, again, is a cultural bottleneck, and no lords or kings are going to be able to collect taxes when there's no food and everything is descended into chaos. And so all of the systems of power and authority that still exist today could only really have arisen after the Long Night. And so right after the Long Night, after the chaos, that's when humanity would have been rebuilding. And that's when we would have seen the arising of new cities, new orders of power, new ways of life. All of these things would have been established right after the Long Night. And it seems to be that way across the world. Great Empire of the Dawn disappears, and in its place, a bunch of other civilizations arise. And then they eventually turn over. Some of them last, some of them don't. Yi Ti has lasted basically since right after the Long Night. Enough to the point where their historical records have the memory of the Great Empire of the Dawn and what came before the Dawn Age. So really smells like the same thing over here. Fisher Queens, they are this mythical civilization that existed before the Long Night, so no one really remembers them very well. Everything from before then is basically fable, because your survivors of the Long Night, they would have told stories about the before times, but very quickly, after only a few generations, these stories would have been talking about things and people that no one could see or remember, and so they really would have taken on the form of myth. So I think that's what we've got here. We've got Fisher Queens as your pre-long night Dawn Age civilization, and the Sarnori arising right after them. So let's read about the Sarnori. All right, girl. The show preening is a bit much. Here, come here. Put you down, okay? Ooh, and I am out of lozenges. Wow, wow. Well, that is a bummer. Let me get a drink then. 1 second. Sorry, guys. Return of the yellow vitamin water. Okay, so let's do a little reading. Such a man may or may not have existed, Huzhor Amai. But none can doubt the glory of the tall men at their height, a proud and quarrelsome people. They were seldom ever united under a single ruler, but their kingdoms dominated the western grasslands, from the forest of Kohor to the eastern shores of the vanished Silver Sea, and 50 leagues beyond. Leagues. Their gleaming cities were strewn across the grasslands like jewels across a green velvet mantle, shining beneath the light of sun and stars. That line also seems like maybe a great Empire of the Dawn wink and a nod, right? Because the velvet green mantle, well, the Yitish emperors are all about the jade and gold. So it's possible they got that from the great Empire of the Dawn. And also Euron speaks of golden gods with gemstone eyes. So gold and green seem to be great Empire of the Dawn colors. And obviously the cities are like the jewels strung across a green mantle. So maybe that's a reference to the gemstone eyes. I don't know. I used to be hunting for tinfoil a little harder than I do now. But the greatest of these cities was Sarnath of the Tall Towers, where the High King dwelt in his fabled palace with 1,000 rooms. Eastward rose Kasath, city of caravans. Sathar, the waterfall city. Oh, let me put the map up while I read this. The other map. This one. Oh, if I close this, it'll... There we go. Okay, perfect. That's what I wanted. So, Kasath, city of caravans. You can see why that could be called that. It's from there. That's the furthest south. It's probably from there that they took off east and west to go trading, and definitely to the south. So, Sathar is the waterfall city, and you can see that Sathar sits right in between the junction of two rivers. They would be flowing out from the lakes and out to that delta where Sath and Sares are. So Sathar, it would be sitting right at the junction of those two rivers. So yes, there could be a waterfall there. There could be a very high flow in that area where the two rivers are dumping into each other. Kind of like where the Tumblestone and the Red Fork meet by River Run. So then it says, Selosh by the Silver Shore, city of scholars, with its vast library and painted walls. Where's Selosh? Oh, that's the northernmost one. It's right by the lake there. Okay. Downstream, where the Sarn turns north, the prosperous river cities, Rathlyar, Hornoth, and Kith, served the ships that plied her deep blue waters. So you can see, yeah, you can see where those three cities are. At the delta, where the Sarn splintered and flowed into the Shivering Sea, could be found the port cities Sath to the west and Saris to the east. The Kingdom of Sarnor, so called, though it boasted 20 rival kings. And that's interesting too, right? No high king. The power seems a little bit distributed, so it's kind of like an alliance of city-states a little bit. It's interesting. Was among the known world's great civilizations for more than 2,000 years, yet much of what we know of them comes only from fragments of their otherwise lost histories, most notably the Summer and Winter Annals, the records of them from Karth, Slaver's Bay, and the Free Cities. Sarnori traders traveled to Valyria and Yi to Leng and to Shai. Sarnori ships sailed the Shivering Sea to Ib and to the Thousand Islands and far Mossavi. So they were accomplished mariners, which is great if you want to tie them to other very tall people like the Lengi or the Maze Makers, for those tinfoilers out there. Let's see here. Sarnori kings warred against the Cathai and the old empire of Gis, and led many a foray against the bands of nomadic horsemen who roamed the steppes to their east. So there you go. The nomadic horsemen to the east, those are the ancestors of the Dothraki, and the Sarnori indeed warred against them often. So when the Dothraki unified and rose up into a great Khalasar and whooped up on the Sarnori, it was a little bit like comeuppance, or, you know, the fruit of the seed that they planted, if you will. So the Sarnori riders wore steel and spider silk and rode coal-black mares, while the greatest of their warriors went to battle in scythed chariots pulled by teams of blood-red horses, oft driven by their wives or daughters, for it was the custom among the Sarnori for men and women to make war together. So you can see a little bit of a transition here. We didn't go straight from the matriarchal fisher queens to the completely male-dominated Dothraki culture. And by the way, this is an intentional comparison here. The fisher queens lived on a city that floated around the Silver Sea. The Dothraki float around the Grass Sea. Okay? So you can see this sort of mirroring. Also, Dany has a ton of fisher queen symbolism. And this is actually, I probably should have mentioned this a minute ago, but that's okay. I have ADHD, and you guys are bearing with me. So Dany, if you know any of the Green Sea symbolism, you know that the Dothraki Sea, it's called a Great Grass Sea for a reason. It looks like a grass sea, but George uses that as a symbol for the Green Sea, meaning the realm, the Weirwood Net realm, the place where the Green Seers live. As I've said many times, and this is a Ravenous Reader thing. All the stuff that Patchface is talking about, under the sea, this and that, that's all about stuff inside the Weirwood Net. Sometimes it's about the others because the others come from the Weirwood Net. So Dany running around the Dothraki Sea is very much Nissa running around inside the Weirwood Net Sea. And that's kind of how I've talked about it. But the Fisher Queen is another parallel that George made. I mean, he probably... Obviously, the Fisher Queens, we don't hear about them until the World of Ice and Fire. So he wrote the Fisher Queens long after Dany. So he would have written them as a mirror to Dany and not the other way around. But since Dany comes later in history, it now appears to us, the reader, as though she is echoing the Fisher Queens. But she essentially... Dothraki culture, again, very patriarchal, but Dany is upending all of that, becoming the Khaleesi, and eventually she's going to climb the Mother of Mountains, which is only for the Cowls to do, and she's going to become, the stallion who mounts the world and unify, the Khalasars or whatever. So that will be bringing it back to an echo of the Fisher Queens, who, again, the Fisher Queens sort of floated around the Silver Sea and ruled, and Dany is now going to be floating around the Grass Sea and ruling. So cool echoes there. And of course, Dany herself, she has the molten silver hair that reminds us of the Silver Sea. The Silver Sea itself is an obvious moon symbol. It's a mirror-like lake. So the moon is a mirror, of course. And the moon is associated with sea because of the tides. All this stuff. You guys know this. So it's a big moon symbol. Also, the fact that we went from the Silver Sea being one big moon symbol into 3 lakes. We've seen that. It's the 3 head of the dragon's 3 moon meteor pattern. We often see when the moon breaks, we see 3 dragon symbols. Of course, Dany hatches the dragons in the pyre. Dany is the original moon symbol walking into the pyre. out come 3 dragons. There's a lot of other echoes of this pattern. I wish I could remember them all. Again, this is like way back in the original mythical astronomy days, but similar pattern here with the silver sea, obvious moon symbol, breaking up into 3 lakes. So when Dany immerses herself in the womb of the world, that's a good Fisher Queen echo, right? The womb of the world is, we see the moon reflected on the waters, right? There's the moon's twin is floating on the water, and then Dany, the moon character, goes into the water and bathes in the water just as the moon appears to be bathing in the water. And it's also the womb of the world. It's an obvious feminine creation symbol. So it's pretty similar. The Silver Sea and the Womb of the World are fairly comparable symbols. This is one of the reasons why we thought the Womb of the World might be part of the Silver Sea originally, when the World of Ice and Fire first came out. So we can at least consider them to be similar symbols. And this may reflect also, let's put it this way. The Fisher Queen myth, if it's a Dawn Age myth, then the Fisher Queen story is the oldest story in the Grasslands. So when the ancestors of the Dothraki came over the Bones Mountains from the Great Empire of the Dawn, again, they must have found the horses on the Great Grass Sea side, on the western side, because the Jogos Nai all have Zorses, and we don't hear about any horses east of the Bones. So it seems like the Dothraki's ancestors, who probably rode Zorses in times of yore, came over the mountains and adapted that same culture to the horses they found there. So what I'm saying is that when the Dothraki culture that we have now, 10,000 years later, that's not going to be a pure culture. That's going to be the ancestors of the Dothraki having come over the mountains and then started to blend with the myths that were already existent on the Grass Sea. So when they talk about the womb of the world that gave birth to the first rider, they're basically saying that their culture also goes back to the Fisher Queens. Or maybe not intentionally saying that, but that is what the myth reflects. The womb of the world is their version of the Silver Sea. So you can see that this Silver Sea Fisher Queen myth migrated over into the lands of the Dothraki because there was contact. We know the Sarnori warred against the ancestors of the Dothraki, and even before that, it seems like there would have been some commonality because, again, the Dothraki and the Sarnori had the same physical appearance, and they're both good with horses. So basically, the Dothraki, their main 2 ancestral groups would have been a common ancestor with the Jogos Nai and a common ancestor of the Sarnori. And so I think from this common ancestor of the Sarnori, they would have gotten the Fisher Queen myth. And so just as the Sarnori say, oh yes, our founding hero is the last of the Fisher Queens, the Dothraki say, well, our first rider rode out of the womb of the world, which is just their version of the Silver Sea. So it's another cultural continuity myth, it would seem. And it also reflects that the Dothraki even have an ancient memory of matriarchal tradition. We also find that in Vaes Dothrak. When you go to Vaes Dothrak, the women are in charge. The crones of the Dash Kalin rule Vaes Dothrak, and the men can't carry steel, and they can't war with one another in Vaes Dothrak. So this shows you there is this memory of matriarchal culture that we can find in Dothraki culture, and probably that is a remnant of Fisher Queen culture. So I hope that made sense. Nymeria is kind of a Fisher Queen figure. That's interesting. I wonder if the Rhoynar are intended to have a memory of that, because they view the river as a mother too. So either the Rhoynar are another example of an ancient matriarchal culture, or perhaps the Rhoynar, the Fisher Queen myth is influencing the Rhoynar. But I don't really... The Rhoynar also are remembered as one of the oldest or first people to have developed steelworking, as are the Sarnori. So perhaps there's a connection there. Let me go back to the other map so we can see the whole thing. So yeah, the Rhoynar really, they didn't go up all the way to the north of Norvos. You can see Goyandro is the northernmost Rhoynish city. And most of it is kind of in the middle. Arnoi, Nysar, the Saros. So they're kind of like right in the middle of Essos there. Dagger Lake. So yeah, I'm not sure how much contact they would have had with the Fisher Queen's culture. Because if neither one of those cultures are riding horses, that's a long way. It's separated by the foothills where Essaria is, Ves Kedok, and also the forests of Qohor, which are pretty dense. And then below the forest of Qohor, you see there's a big swamp area. So there's kind of a natural barrier here, right where Qohor is. So I would say it's unlikely that the Rhoynar had contact with... Well, no, I take that back. If the first Men and the Andals began in outside of the... Oh, okay, I see what you're saying, Austin. If the first Men and the Andals began near the Silver Sea, then they would have crossed over the lands of the Rhoyne. So perhaps that Sarnori metalworking idea, there is a line of continuity there, but it's really sketchy. It's hard to say. Now, Austin's perhaps making the point that this is a symbolic thing. Yes, Nymeria's a different take on the same concept of the Fisher Queen. She is a person that represents her people. She's very much the epitome of her people, and she leads her whole people to safety. So she's a nation builder and all of that too. Okay, so let's see here. And so yeah, the idea that the Sarnori, they are not a rough transition from a matriarchal culture. They're men and women. They go to war together. So there's a certain amount of equality there. And their power is not completely centralized. There's a bunch of rival kings and kingdoms. And, it's, it's decentralized. So let me pick up, where was I? So yeah, the riders, steel and spider silk, they roll coal black mares and blood red horses, scythe chariots. So this is, again, another sort of Egyptian comparison. The Egyptians, they did not domesticate horses, but once they got horses, I guess once the Hyksos came to Egypt is when they got chariots. And after that, they were definitely badass chariot warriors. So we see that here. And it says, even in the Seven Kingdoms, the glory of Sarnath of the tall towers was celebrated, and Lomas Longstrider included the palace with 1,000 rooms amongst his 9 wonders made by man. Today, however, the kingdom of Sarnor is largely forgotten, and there are many and more in Westeros, even students at the Citadel, who know little and less of its long, proud history. Their towers are all fallen, their cities ruined and abandoned, and noxious weeds and tall grasses grow where once their farms and fields and towns were found. The lands they once ruled are but thinly peopled and traversed only by the wandering Khalasars of the Dothraki horse lords, and such caravans as the Khals permit to make the long, slow crossing from the free cities to Vaes Dothrak and the Mother of Mountains. Travelers name these the Haunted Lands, for the many ruined cities that dot them. or the great desolation for their emptiness. But it is as the Dothraki see that these grasslands are best known today. That usage is comparatively recent, however, for the Dothraki are a young race, and it was only since the Doom destroyed Valyria that their Khalasars came to dominate these lands, sweeping out of the east with fire and steel to conquer and destroy the ancient cities that once thrived here and carrying off the people into bondage. The fall of the great Sarnori kingdoms took less than a century, even as the free cities of the west became locked in a savage struggle for domination during what became known as the Century of Blood. This is following. Cleo, you gotta wait, girl. The grasslands, too, exploded into war. During the years that followed the Doom, the riders of the eastern steppes, hitherto divided into threescore quarrelsome tribes at perpetual war with one another, had finally been united under a single leader, a Dothraki cow called Mengo. Counseled by his mother, the purported witch queen Doshi, Cal Mengo compelled the other nomads to accept his rule, extinguishing or enslaving those who refused. Then, in his old age, he turned his eye westward. So this is cool. This is very archetypal Dothraki couple. The witch queen, Doshi. So her name, she literally represents the Dosh Khaleen, essentially. That's what it sounds like to me. A great call and a witch queen. That's, just how it's supposed to be. Hang on, guys. Let me grab the bird. Yeah. Yeah, I was smoking. I used the bird for cover. So let me break the narrative there and mention that it says in one of the sidebars, the old empire of Geese fought 5 wars against the rising freehold of Valyria. History tells us. In the second and third Giscari wars, the tall men took up their swords as allies of Valyria. In the fourth war, rival kings took opposite sides, some joining the Giscari and others the Valyrians. Lomas Longstrider wrote of a fallen obelisk carved about with the figures of Gis's allies in that fourth war, and noted the tallest warriors depicted, made taller by high helms, were the Sarnori. The obelisk was raised by Gis, but the carvings were Valyrian, for all the warriors were captured and enslaved. So this is a little interesting little tidbit that George threw at us, right? He's like, oh, how do we know? Well, we found this stele, and it had carvings on it. And so it's a carving by the Valyrians. It shows all the defeated allies of Gis, one of which were some amount of Sarnori. So that's pretty cool. So let's read about Calmengo. Calmengo's interesting. Let me move my keyboard too. Oh, girl. Are you going to be difficult today? Well, you have been difficult. Why am I saying it future tense? You've already been difficult. Yeah. Okay. Contemptuous of the horse lords, who had been no more than a nuisance to them for centuries, the tall men ignored the threat from the east for far too long, even as the Khalasars began to raid across their eastern marches. Some of their kings even sought to use the Dothraki in their own wars, offering them gold and slaves and other gifts to fight against their rivals. Calmengo took these gifts gladly, then took the conquered lands as well, burning fields and farms and towns to return the grasslands to their wild state, for the Dothraki considered the earth to be their mother, and think it sinful to cut her flesh with plows and spades and axes. This is one of the most interesting little tidbits thrown in there, like, oh yes, the Dothraki literally consider it evil to plow the earth, and that's why they destroy all the farming. They destroy all the cities. They're like, oh, they're returning the earth to its wild state. So they're like Greenpeace. They're like Greenpeace gone even further. They're eco-terrorists. It's cool though. I like that. It makes sense. It makes sense that like they're so hunter-gatherer that like farming is just straight up evil to them. So that's pretty cool. Also, we saw this happen with the First Men. Some of the rival First Men tribes, when the Andals invaded, they sought to ally with the Andals against their rival First Men tribes, not realizing the greater threat. And it's Mango, not Mango, with an E, Mango. So I'm not sure if that's sun symbolism or not. We'll get to Mango in a second. Oh God, what was I talking about? Oh yes. So rival First Men houses. See, the First Men didn't see themselves as a nation really. They saw themselves more as independent tribes and kingdoms. So when the first Andals came, they just sought to use the Andals to their advantage in their current little petty struggles, not realizing that their entire continent was about to be conquered. Similarly, we're told that by law and custom, all the lesser Sarnori kings were subject to the High King, but in truth, very few of the High Kings ever exercised any real power. So really, this was an alliance of city-states, like I was saying, not a kingdom, quote-unquote. So it makes sense that when the Dothraki started threatening, they weren't able to quickly mobilize. They probably got together and talked about it and argued and debated and passed a resolution to do something about it next year. And then here come the Dothraki. So not until Mango's son Calmoro brought his Khalasar to the very gates of Sathar, the fabled waterfall city, did the tall men seem to realize their peril. Broken in battle, the men of Sathar were put to the sword, their women and children carried off as slaves. 3/4 of them died on the grueling march south to the slave marts at Giskari Hill City, Hazdan Mo. Where's Hazdan Mo? See, can we find it? Nope, don't see it. Don't see it. But if you look at Giskar, it's just south of Slaver's Bay. It's on the backside of these mountains that sort of isolate Yunkai Marine and Astapor from the lands of the Lazar. So wherever town they're talking about, it's somewhere in Giskar. So it's south of Lazar, essentially. So it's a long march. This should be something like the Trail of Tears or some of the other like horrific marches of captives and slaves that we have heard about through history. So this is George telling us 3/4 of the people died. So even though we're not given the details of this march, you can fill in the blanks, like I said, from real world history. And you can know that this is a horrific thing that happened. An entire civilization was wiped out, enslaved, and then marched hundreds of miles from their homeland, at a furious pace, so much so that 3/4 of them died. So this is basically a genocide that's happening here. Let's see here. Let's see, yeah, 3/4 of them died. Sathar, the loveliest of the cities of the grasslands, was burned to ash and rubble. It is written that it was Calmoro himself who gave the ruins their new name, Yali Kamai, the place of wailing children. How poetic. Even then, the kings of Sarnor proved unable to unite. As Sathar burned, the kings of Kasath to the west and Gornath to the north sent forth their armies, not to aid their neighbors, but to lay claim to a share of the plunder. In their greed for land, Kasath and Gornath even came into conflict with one another and fought a pitched battle 3 days' ride west of Sathar as plumes of black smoke rose in the eastern sky. Grey Waste Tim is mentioning the Armenian genocide. That's definitely a genocide that happened. So you're saying there was a march into the desert by the Turks? Yeah, I read up on that a long time ago when I first started listening to System of a Down. It was like over 20 years ago, and I learned all about the Armenian stuff. But yeah, Yeah, it is. It would be comparable to that. Something like that. So here we go. So that's crazy, right? There, these two Sarnori kingdoms that should be uniting to fight the Dothraki. Instead, they are fighting with each other. So, yeah, the Turks say it didn't happen. They're lying about that. See, this is not the place to chronicle the events of the years and wars that followed. Shamefully lying about it, I should add. As the great cities of the kingdoms of Sarnor fell piecemeal to the Dothraki. Those who wish a more detailed account are directed to Bellows' The End of the Tall Men, Maester Illister's Horse Tribes, being a study of the nomads of the eastern plains of Essos, and the eastern chapters and appendices of Maester Joseph's Battles and Sieges of the Century of Blood, and Vigaro's definitive Ruined Cities, Stolen Gods. So, one of those books caught my eye. Maester Illister, Horse Tribes, being a study of the nomads of the eastern plains of Essos. So that's interesting. A book about the nomads of eastern Essos is going to involve the story of Sarnor. Not just because Sarnor fell to the Dothraki, but possibly because they're also horse peoples from the same area. Like I said, I really do think there's a common origin there. So, let's see here. Let it suffice to say that all the proud Sarnori cities, only Sath remains unruined today, and that port city is a sad place, much diminished from what it once was, surviving largely because of support from Ib and Lorath, whose colony of Morosh is nearby. Only in Sath do men still name themselves Teges Fen. Fewer than 20,000 remain, when once the tall men numbered in millions. So from millions of people to 20,000 people in one city, only 400 years later, and really, Sarnor was wiped out in 100 years. So we're talking about millions of people being wiped out. So this is absolutely a genocide that left only 20,000 people. So I mean, this is a real genocide here. I mean, this is like... That's just, I mean, it's a depopulation of an entire kingdom. It's kind of staggering to comprehend, really. Only there are the 100 gods of the kingdom of Sarnor still worshipped. Oh, that's interesting, 100 gods. So they're very polytheistic, similar to Valeria, I notice. The bronze and marble likenesses that once adorned the streets and temples of the tall men now lean crookedly, overgrown by weeds, along the grassy ways of Vaes Dothrak, the sacred city of the horse lords. So some of those statues in Vaes Dothrak may be Sarnori monuments there. I should go back and pull up that list and see if we can figure out which one it is. Sathar was the first of the cities of the grasslands to fall to the Dothraki, but by no means the last. 6 years later, Calmoro razed Kasath as well. In this attack, his riders were aided, incredibly, by Gornath, whose kings had made common cause with the Dothraki and had taken one of Moro's daughters to wife. Yet Gornath itself fell next, a dozen years afterward. Calhorro had, by that time, slain Calmoro, ending the line of the mighty Calmengo. The king of Gornath died at the hands of his own Dothraki wife, who despised him for his weakness, we are told. Afterward, Calhorro took her for his own, as rats devoured the corpse of her late husband. Well, that's some brutal shit now, isn't it? Wow. So Horro was the last of the great Khals to command the allegiance of all Dothraki. When he was slain by a rival, only 3 years after the destruction of Gornath, the great Khalasar splintered into a dozen lesser hordes, and the riders once again resumed their quarrelsome ways. Yet the reprieve this provided the kingdom of Sarnor proved short-lived, for the tall men had shown their weakness, and the Khals who followed Horro shared his taste for conquest. In the years that followed, they strove to outdo one another by conquering ever wider territories, destroying the cities of the grasslands, enslaving their peoples, carrying their broken gods back to Vaes Dothrak to testify to their victories. One by one, the remaining cities of the tall men were overwhelmed and destroyed, leaving only ruins and ashes to mark where their proud towers once stood. So then we're going to talk about the fall of Selash. So before we do that, I just want to point out Interestingly, just for you authors, we talk about world building and writing books and stuff here. It's interesting that the way that George has written it, you've always got to add these wrinkles, right? So it's not just that one great call united the tribes. They came and wiped out Sarnor, and that was that. Well, no, the first call, he attacked one city. Then his son took it further and destroyed a bunch more cities. But then we have some intermarriage going on where, one of the Sarnori kings is taking the Call's daughter as queen. And then a different Call kills that Call. And now the Dothraki fragment in the middle of their conquest of the Sarnori, and the individual Calls start picking off the remaining Sarnori cities. So it's just an interesting little wrinkles that George has put in the writing here to make it more like history. Like nothing ever holds together. No plan ever lasts forever. And so uniting the all the different Dothraki tribes, it's hard. And you can't, George is trying to show us that you can't maintain that for very long. I think that's part of the point there. Okay, so let's talk about the fall of Salosh, city of scholars. So one by one, the cities of the tall men were overwhelmed and destroyed, leaving only ruins and ashes to mark where their proud towers once stood. For scholars and students of history, the fall of Salosh by the Silver Shore was especially tragic. For when that city of scholars burned, its great library was not spared, and most of the history of the tall men and the peoples who had gone before them were lost for all time. So one of the ways that George is keeping his world in a fantasy-like primitive state is by constantly destroying the history and the libraries. Like Valeria, all of its libraries got burned in the Doom, and Sarnor's libraries were burned. So it's like this way George can obscure the ancient history. If we had the Sarnori records, we'd know a lot more about Fisher Queens and the Cathai and all that stuff. We might even know more about the Great Empire of the Dawn. We would. We absolutely would. But then we wouldn't be able to sit here and have this fun stream speculating about all these gaps to fill in. So this is what he has done. George has repeatedly burned libraries. Obviously, Library of Alexandria. Again, Sarnor with another Egyptian correlation, right? So one by one, okay, I already read that. Kith and Hornath soon followed, destroyed by rival Khals, each of whom sought to outdo the other in savagery. The fortress city, Mardosh the Unconquerable, defied the horse lords the longest. Let's see, Mardosh. Where's Mardosh? Gonna have to bring up the other map. Mardosh. Okay, so you can see it's at the end of the river. So if you're going down the river and conquering, Hornath and Kith were next, then we came to Mardosh. This was like the last stand of the Sarnori, essentially. Mardosh the Unconquerable. For close unto 6 years, the city endured, cut off from its hinterlands, encircled by a succession of Khalasars. Driven to starvation, the Mardoshi devoured their dogs and horses, then rats and mice and other vermin, and finally began to eat their own dead. When they could endure no longer, the surviving warriors of the city garrison slew their own wives and children to keep them from the Khals, then opened the city gates and rushed forth for one final attack. They were cut down to a man. Afterward, the Dothraki named the ruins of Mardosh Ves Gorkoyi, the city of the blood charge. So that's pretty dark. That's real dark. The fall of Mardosh finally awakened the remaining Sarnori kings to the depth of their peril. Putting aside their own quarrels and rivalries, at last the tall men gathered from up and down the Sarn, assembling a great army beneath the walls of Sarnath, intent on breaking the power of the Khals for good and all. So Sarnath in the middle. Okay, so basically the Dothraki sweep through, they bust up all the cities, but there's still lots of Sarnori left, and they rally together to form a big army, and they go to Sarnath, which you can see is in the middle of the kingdom. So the last battle was at Mardosh, but then sometime later, the Sarnori rally, and they fight a battle beneath the walls of Sarnath, which had already been sacked, right? So led by Mazor Alexi, last of the high kings, they struck out boldly to the east. So this is another clue. Remember I said Huzhor Amai sounds like Azor Ahai? Well, now we've got a great leader named Mazor Alexi. So it's literally Azor with an M in front, Mazor. Also, this could be a Ender's Game shout out, Mazor Rackham, but I'm not sure how much George is thinking about that. But Mazor Alexi, so you could call him Azor Alexi. I'm not sure about the Alexi, but the Azor part, that's, pretty close. So you have a continuity. Remember, that's why I was saying Azor High could be a title. So then you have Huzhor Amai, the Amazing. That could be a title. And then this guy takes up the name Mazor Alexi. So this could just be another, again, this is thousands of years after Huzhor Amai. So maybe it's mutated by this point and it's said a little differently. Or maybe he took one of those words and tagged on the word Alexi, which meant something else, and modified the title that everyone would have been familiar with. But it's hard to think that George has written the two named heroes of the Sarnori culture as Mazor Alexi and Huzhor Amai, just coincidentally sounding like Azor Ahai, right? That seems unlikely. And then as someone pointed out earlier, of course, there's also Hugo, the Andal. And the Maesters themselves say, well, Hugo, and Hugor, he's related to Hugor Hill. But then Hugor sounds like Huzhor. So this idea that the Andals came from the Silver Sea gains credibility. You have a title, Huzhor Amai, used by the Sarnori, but Huzhor Amai is the last descendant of the Fisher Queens. So if the Andals were living in that area too, well, their cultural hero is Hugor Hill. So maybe the Hugor and Huzhor are both going back to Azor or some other word that is similar. So let's hear about this really is the true last stand of the tall men. So led by Mazor Alexi, last of the high kings, they struck out boldly to the east. In the tall grass halfway between Sarnath and the ruins of Kasath, they met the assembled power of 4 Khalasars on what forever after was known as the Field of Crows. And I have art for this. So this is between Sarnath and Kasath. So right in the middle there, and let's pull up the artwork. It's in the book here, but instead of holding the book up to the camera, I'll do a screen share. It'll look better, especially now that I'm in 1080. This is by Paolo Pugioni. There we go. So this is the scene that we're reading right now. So 4 Khalasars: Kal-Hero, Kal-Kano, Kal-Loso the Lame, and Kal-Zako, commanded almost 80,000 horsemen between them. The great host of the High King of Sarnor was led by 6,000 scythed chariots, with 10,000 armored riders behind them, and another 10,000 light horsemen, many of them women, on the flanks. So we've got heavy cavalry, light cavalry, and scythed chariots to meet the Dothraki horse, the horde. Behind them marched the Sarnori foot, close to 100,000 spearmen and slingers, giving the tall men a great advantage in numbers. On this, all chroniclers agree. So the slingers, those are not to be overlooked. The Tolosi slingers that we see today are deadly accurate and destructive. So this is quite the fighting force that the Sarnori put together. So as battle was joined, the Sarnori chariots, remember only 6,000 of them, threatened to carry all before them. Their earth-shattering advance smashed through the center of the Dothraki horde, the spinning blades on the wheels of their chariots slicing through the legs of the Dothraki horses. when Kalhero himself went down before them, cut to pieces and trampled. His Khalasar broke and fled. As the chariots thundered after the fleeing horsemen, the High King and his armored riders plunged in after them, followed by the Sarnori foot, waving their spears and screaming victory. Their elation was short-lived. The rout was feigned. And this, George is pulling this directly from Mongol tactics. They did this all the time. The Mongols did. When they had drawn the tall men deep into the trap, it's a trap, the fleeing Dothraki turned suddenly and unleashed a storm of arrows from their great bows. The Khalasars of Kalkano and Kalzako swept in from north and south, while Loso the Lame and his screamers circled round and attacked the Sarnori from the rear, cutting off their retreat. Completely encircled, the High King and his mighty host were cut to pieces. Some say 100,000 men died that day, amongst them Mazor Alexei, 6 lesser kings, and more than 70 lords and heroes. As the crows feasted on the corpses, the riders of the Khalasars walked amongst the dead and squabbled over their valuables. Bereft of defenders, Sarnath of the Tall Towers fell to Loso the Lame less than a fortnight later. So I guess Sarnath hadn't been conquered already. I said that earlier. Sorry, I was wrong. Not even the palace with 1,000 rooms was spared when Khal Loso put the city to the torch. And that's Loso the Lame, because George loves alliteration. The remaining cities of the grasslands followed one by one as the century of blood drew to its close. Saris at the mouth of the Sarn was the last to fall, but yielded little in the way of slaves or plunder, for the people of the city had largely fled by the time Khal Zago descended upon it. It must not be thought that the kingdom of Sarnor was the only victim of the horse lords. The Valerian colony Assaria, sometimes remembered as the lost free city, was similarly overwhelmed. Today its ruins are known to the Dothraki as Vaes Kadok, the city of corpses. In the north, Kaldako sacked and burned Ibish, reclaiming most of the small foothold the men of Ib had carved out on the northern coast of Essos. A much smaller Ibonese colony survives in the dense forest beyond beside the Shivering Sea, huddled around the town they have named New Ibish. In the south, other Khals led their hordes into the Red Waste, destroying the Kathai towns and cities that once dotted that desert, until only the great city of Karth remained, protected by its towering triple wall. Very cool. We got a PayPal from Natasha. Thank you, Natasha. Do I know about the disputed lands theory that the Fisher Queens and the Great Empire of the Dawn married each other, hence the Amethyst Empress succeeding the throne, where previously only male gemstone emperors ruled? Yes, I do. I am vaguely aware of it. It's been a while since I read it over. But I remember thinking kind of like, yeah, maybe, but it's just not enough to connect it. So I left that one hanging as a maybe. And that's kind of how I said it today. Like maybe they had contact. The name is the main clue, that name of Huzhor Amai, and the idea that the Dothraki did come over the mountains, or at least the ancestors of the Dothraki. But the idea that there was concurrent contact between the Fisher Queens and the Great Empire, that I don't think so. I would much more likely connect Nissa Nissa and the Amethyst Empress to the god Empress of Lang, because Lang has, the old ones lurking about who seem to be green men, and that's how Nissa Nissa ends up being part child of the forest or part green man, green woman, something like that. So I really don't think Sarnor or the Fisher Queens have too much to... Well, I don't think the Fisher Queen specifically had too much contact with the Great Empire of the Dawn. But it's all speculation, so I'm not sure. She was also looking to connect the womb of the world to those other two lakes, but of course then I found this thing that kind of shot that idea down. So she does do some really cool research in that video about inland seas and grass areas and stuff like that, which is pretty awesome. So definitely check out the Disputed Lands channel. And if you're interested in this topic, then you can check out her video about this, about the Silver Sea, and see what she had to say about it. Definitely did some good research. So, a couple more things here. So there's a little sidebar about the Cathai that I want to read real quick. It says, despite their long history, little can be said of any certainty of the Cathai, a people now gone from the world save for Karth. What can be said is that the Cathai arose in the grasslands and established towns there, coming into contact and occasional conflict with the Sarnori. They would oft have the worst of these wars, and so began to drift further south, creating new city-states. One such, Karth, was founded on the coast of the Summer Sea. Yet the lands in the south of Essos proved more inhospitable than those the Cathai had vacated, turning to desert even as they established their foothold there. The Cathai people were already well on their way to collapse when the doom struck, and any hopes of using the chaos in the Summer Sea to their advantage vanished when the Dothraki attacked, destroying all the remaining Cathai cities save for Karth itself. Yet, in a way, the Dothraki destruction led to a resurgence for Karth. Forced to look instead to the sea, the pureborn who ruled Karth swiftly constructed a fleet and took control of the Jade Gates, the strait between Karth and the Great Morak, which joins the Summer Sea to the Jade Sea. With the Valyrian fleet destroyed and Volantis' attention turned west, there were none to oppose them as they established control over the most direct route between east and west, and so gained immeasurably in both trade and levied tolls for safe passage. So this is what so Karth is definitely, at least according to this, founded by the Cathai who moved south from the Silver Sea. But the thing is, cities are usually built at geographically advantageous places. And if I pull up the Lands of Ice and Fire map again, you can see that Karth is a very obvious place to put a city. And so, when the Cathai got there and established a city, there were almost certainly people already living there. That's how history works. And so, what I'm thinking is that, because you can see, okay, Karth, it's right here along the trade route. So, the cities of Yi are very old. Some of them are built on ruins of Great Empire of the Dawn towns, in all likelihood. And we can see that from Asabad to Karth, we're following a coast road. Remember we talked about the Aboriginals of Australia, the Aborigines of Australia having gone out of Africa around 70,000 years ago and having essentially walked all the way to Australia, where they essentially walked along the coast. And similarly, the ancient North Americans who crossed the Bering Strait, well, guess what? Before they crossed the Bering Strait, it looks like now the Americas were actually peopled by earlier waves of people from northern Russia and Siberia who migrated along the coast in boats and by walking. And that's how we get Monteverde in South America having pre-Clovis human signs of human civilization that go back to 14 and 15,000 and maybe even 23,000 BC. How did they get down to South America so quick before Clovis civilization even developed? Well, walking along the coast. So this coastal route would have been in use before the Long Night during the Great Empire of the Dawn times. We can see that the name Asabad is similar to Bayasabad, which means Asabad, that name at least, probably comes from the kingdom of Hyrkoon, which created Bayasabad, Cimmeriana, and Kaya. So this place, Asabad, is a very old city, and it represents a place of mingling between Yi and Hyrkoon. So what I'm saying is that when the Cathai got to the location of Karth and built a city there, they probably would have encountered people that were already living there that would have fled from the Great Empire of the Dawn. And so we can see that Karth has some of that Far Eastern influence that has glommed on to these people, even though they're from the Silver Sea area. So that's an interesting implied mixing of cultures there. Anu, the Ice Spiders is not going to be a live stream, bro. That's going to be a video. I am working on it. And that's not gonna be a Starry Wisdom Sunday. That's gonna be a video that comes out. I will do a premiere for it, but all right. So let's see. Is there any more Sarnori stuff I want to read here? Yeah, let's read a little more about the Dothraki. So many in the free cities believed that the westward thrust of the Horse Lords was turned back at Qohor, when Cal Temo's attempt to take that city was defeated by the valor of the 3,000 unsullied slave soldiers who stood fast against the 18 charges of his screamers. To believe that the stand of the 3,000 of Qohor put an end to the Dothraki dreams of conquest, however, suggests a complacency akin to the High Kings of Sarnor's, when the Horse Lords first came boiling out of the east. Wiser men know it is only a matter of time until the Khalasars unite, again, under some great Khal, and turn west once more in search of new conquests. So you have to remember, this is all recent history. This only happened 300 and 400 years ago, that they destroyed the last Sarnori cities, 300 years ago. So they've disintegrated since then. But yes, if you're someone that lives in the free cities, you're worried about this happening again. The Dothraki are not stable. You can't count on them to remain fractious. This is why they buy off the Dothraki. This is why Illyrio lavishes riches upon them. Like, it really is a threat. If they do not buy off the Dothraki, they will come and burn their cities and sell all of the people into slavery. Like, they literally will do that. The Dothraki have oft attempted to extend their power eastward as well, but there they have found the Bones Mountains to be an almost insurmountable obstacle. Those bleak, inhospitable peaks form an immense stone wall between the Horse Lords and the riches of the further east. Only 3 passes exist large enough to bring any army through, and to thwart those stand the mighty fortress cities Bayasabad, Samiriana, and Kaya defended by tens of thousands of redoubtable female warriors, the last remnants of the great kingdom of Herkun, which once flourished beyond the Bones in what is now known as the Great Sand Sea. Many a Khal has died beneath their walls, and still those walls stand inviolate. So again, it's interesting. Herkun is known as a patrimony, but it's run by warrior women. So there's and the warrior women, of course, they castrate 99 out of every 100 males and keep one to breed with. So they're kind of like squishers, side note. But so it's kind of like that one male who's the breeding male. He probably is designated as like a king or something like that, but he doesn't really have power. So that word patrimony, I'm not sure what it's meant to imply. It may not be a patriarchal culture necessarily. Let me look up that word. Let's see if it implies something different. Property inherited from one's father or male ancestor. That's all it means. Okay. So, yeah, I guess it doesn't really necessarily mean that the patrimony of Herkun was a patriarchy, quote unquote. But it's interesting that the 3 cities that are left over are ruled by warrior women who consistently kick the Dothraki's ass. That's kind of funny, huh? Of course, they're using their, they have huge castles athwart mountain passes, so they're strategically placed. So west of the Bones, however, from the Shivering Sea to the north, to the Painted Mountains and Skahazadan in the south, the vast expanse of grass where civilization first flowered remains a windswept desolation, where no man dares plow a furrow, plant a seed, or raise a house, for fear of the Khalasars that wander freely there to this very day, exacting gifts from any man who seeks to cross their lands, and making war upon each other. The Dothraki remain nomads still, a savage and wild people who prefer tents to palaces. Seldom still, the Khalasars drive their great herds and horses and goats endlessly across their sea, fighting one another when they meet, and occasionally moving beyond the borderlands of their own lands for slaves and plunder, or to claim the gifts that the magisters and triarchs of the free cities bestow upon them whenever they chance to wander too far west. And then it goes on to talk about Vaes Dothrak, which we know about. Cool. So that's pretty much the grasslands there. There's something else I'm looking for. Bear with me here. Yeah, so there's another Dothraki cowl that's mentioned called he's called the Dragon of the North, and there may be some symbolism going on here just because of that name. So check this out, guys. They're talking about Ib. The Ibbenese foothold on Essos was as large as Ib itself and far richer. More and more of the hairy men crossed over from the islands to make their fortunes there, cutting down the trees to put the land under the plow, damming the rivers and streams, mining the hills. Ruling over these domains was Ibish, a fishing village that swelled to become a thriving port, and the second city of... Girl, stop. Come on. Oh, those claws. Sorry, guys. So they're cutting down the trees of the woods walkers. That's what they're doing. And all that ended 200 years ago with the coming of the Dothraki. The horse lords had hitherto shunned the forests of the northern coasts. Some say this was because of their reverence for the vanished woods walkers. Others because they feared their powers. Whatever the truth, the Dothraki did not fear the men of Ib. Khal after Khal began to make incursions into Ibbenese territories, overrunning their farms and fields and holdfasts of the hairy men with fire and steel, putting the males to the sword while carrying off their wives into slavery. Today, only ruins remain where Ibish once stood. Oh, whoops, I skipped a paragraph, sorry. The Ibbenese, a notoriously avaricious, and yea, even... Okay, sorry, just skipping ahead. The Ibbenese refused to pay the tribute of the Khals that the Khals demanded, choosing to fight instead. Though the men of Ib won several notable victories, famously destroying the huge Khalasar of the fearsome Khal Unko in one epic battle, the Dothraki only came in greater numbers, as each new Khal sought to eclipse the conquests of the last. The Khalasars pushed the Ibbenese farther and farther back, until at last they overwhelmed even the great city of Ibish. Khal Skoro was the first to take the city, breaking through the whalebone gates to loose the temples and treasuries and carry off the city's gods to face Dothrak. The Ibbenese rebuilt, but a generation later, Ibish was sacked again by Khal Rogo, who put half the city to the torch and marched 10,000 women to slavery. Today, only ruins remain where Ibish once stood, a place the Dothraki name Vaes Arasak, or City of Cowards. For when the Khalasar of Unko's grandson, Khal Dako, approached to sack the city once again, the remaining inhabitants took to their ships and fled back across the city to Ib. In his wrath, Dako not only put the abandoned city to the torch, but burned so much of the surrounding countryside that he was thereafter known as the Dragon of the North. Ib retains a modest foothold on Essos even to this day, on a small peninsula surrounded by the sea and defended by a wooden wall almost as long as the ice wall of the Night's Watch, if not a third as high, a towering earth and timber palisade bristling with defensive towers and protected by a deep ditch. Behind the earthworks, the men of Ib have built the new town of New Ibish to rule over their much diminished domains, but the sailors say that the new town is a sad and squalid place, more akin to Ib Sar than the thriving city that the horse lords reduced to ruins. So here's Khal Dako. And this is time out for a little bit of horror. Terio Erastes, the great Braavosi adventurer, kept a record of his time among the Dothraki and witnessed the fall of Ibish while a guest of Khal Dako. His chronicle, Fire Upon the Grass, notes that Khal Dako was said to take great pride in being accounted the Dragon of the North, but at the end he came to rue it, for when his Khalasar was broken in battle by that of Khal Temo, the younger Khal took the elder captive and fed him to the flames. That's bad. Cutting off his hands and feet and genitals and roasting them before his own eyes. Oh, that's even worse. After first burning his wives and sons in the same manner. Oh, geez. Okay. So, George has reeled out the horror. The structure of this sentence is just mind-bending. So yeah, he took the elder Captel and burned him. After cutting off his hands and feet and genitals and roasting them in front of his eyes, and also after burning his wives and sons in the same manner. Oh, okay, well then. So, Dothraki, not very nice people. Yes. Now, for symbolism, we've got a dragon of the north, think Jon Snow perhaps, who's conquering a people who protected themselves with a wall that's compared to the wall of Westeros. So, is this like a parallel to fighting the others? I mean, it seems like it's set up that way. We've got a dragon burning down the lands of people who, again, built a big wall to protect themselves. So I guess the Ibbenese would be the others in this. And of course, the Ibbenese are said to have very prominent blue blood vessels on their skin. So maybe that's meant to make us think of the blue blood of the others. And the Ibbenese war against the children. And I do think even though the children had something to do with the creation of the others, obviously the Green Seers are now against the others. So that kind of all tracks. I just don't know what the point is. So I hope John's not going to end up getting burned and tortured like Daco did. That would suck. He might get fed to the fire, though. That kind of makes sense. Anyways, I'm not sure about that parallel, but I just wanted to mention it. If you guys have any clues, let me know. Grey Waste Tim, yeah, take a hack at it. Let me know. Well, the Ibbenese are hairy men, so they're not first men. I do think George is showing us, again, archaic humanoids and divergent evolution and all that. But, yeah. So, guys, we're over 2 hours already. That kind of flew by. But, yeah. If you have any final, 2.5 hours, Jesus. So if you have any questions, let me know. Last call. And then I'm going to wrap it up. What do you think, Grey Waste Tim? How'd you like the stream, buddy? I've told you everything there is to know about the Grasslands, Fisher Queens, Kingdom of Sarnor. Sarnor definitely sounds like a good place to live. Tall towers, libraries, city of scholars. And just the fact that they didn't centralize their power shows they weren't really too concerned with dominating one another. They were probably happy to just drink wine and read books and build towers and stuff. So, yeah, the ancient civilization of the Rhoynar and Sarnor. These are the two places you'd want to live. But of course, by the time that we get to their downfall, they've grown complacent and quite greedy and all that stuff. So, you know, as happens over time. Yeah, so perhaps maybe a Magic Cat is right about this. Maybe the whole point of the parallel is to suggest that the others built the wall. And the fact that the wall's built out of wood maybe suggests a weirwood origin. Whoa, Austin with some tinfoil. What's this now? You think Mel was in Ib when it was overrun? She remembers arrows coming over a great wooden wall? What memory is this? I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, what are you... You stumped me here, Austin Flowers. You totally stumped me. What are you talking about? I think... Isn't that like a vision of Hardhome? Let's see. Snowflakes swirled from a dark sky, and ashes rose to meet them, the gray and the white whirling around each other as flaming arrows arced above a wooden wall, and dead things shambled silent through the cold, beneath a great gray cliff where fires burned inside like 100 caves. Yeah, that's Hardhome. Then the wind rose, and the white mist came sweeping in, impossibly cold, and one by one the fires went out. Yeah, that's definitely Hardhome and the Screaming Caves. So that's a vision, not a memory. Unless I'm mistaken. So I don't think that has anything to do with Ib. No, because the line, it transitions. The line before, she's remembering Melanie Lot 7. But then this very clearly is not a memory, because there's dead men shambling through the forest. There weren't whites at Ib, and the cliff with all the caves with the fires, that's obviously Hardhome and the Screaming Caves. So no, I don't think so. I don't think those are memories, and I don't think it makes any sense for her to be an Ib either. Like, what's the point of that? She's definitely not Ibonese. So I don't know. I don't get that one. I still love you, but I don't like that tinfoil. It doesn't make sense to me. Other questions? Plus, she was sold to a red temple when she was young. So what would... There's no red temples in Ib. Can Dany rule Westeros from across the narrow sea? No, that would never work. It's hard enough to rule Westeros as it is when you're in Westeros. Oh, don't ask me about NAJ. I'm not even not responding to that. I'm not taking that bait. Not taking that bait. No, there's just no evidence of Valorism being connected to the Ibonese. There's no suggestion of that. And the Ibonese would have their own religion because they weren't even like proper humans. So they're archaic humanoids. Oh yeah, I don't even talk about secret parentage tinfoil here. Why is Steph Curry so overrated? I don't know how to change names. You better watch out. You better watch out. I will ban you and then unban you just to send a message. What's super chat, Jackie? Let's see. I don't have the nimble doc to help me today. Minty is out doing stuff. Imagicat. Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. From Imagicat. Squisher member for 5 months. Can't believe I ignored her question. Terrible. Doesn't seem overly significant, but do you think we're meant to connect the floating palaces of the Fisher Queens with the Crannogs of the Neck? Okay, thank you for mentioning this. I totally meant to talk about this and forgot. Great question. So, can we connect it? It very well could George be just reusing the same cool fantasy idea. But let's say whatever's weird about the Crannog men comes from the Children of the Forest influence. Possibly even from Squisher influence. If you really want to go there. Because we've seen the aquatic religions are all across the middle of Westeros. And that stuff about breathing mud and stuff, that doesn't even sound like Children of the Forest anymore. So it's hard to say what's the deal with Greywater Watch. But it would appear to be some sort of... It's probably not a castle per se, but more light. I mean, you obviously can make floating platforms in a swamp and do stuff like that. However, it definitely seems magical, right? I guess that's what I'm trying to say. The Greywater Watch sounds like sorcery of some kind. So yeah, we've got a floating city in both cases. Now, the Fisher Queen Silver Sea is near the forest of the Ifakevron. It's very close. You can see that the edge of the forest of the Ifakevron pretty much bumps up against where the Silver Sea would have been. Very, very close. So, the Fisher Queens, are we supposed to think about green seers and skin changers, or people that have intermarried with skin changers and green seers? It's possible. I think there's much more evidence that the Dothraki have the skin changing gene. And you can see what it looks like when the author tries to give you those clues. They revered these woods walkers. They bond with their horses for life. They don't like cutting down trees. You know, like there's a lot of things that start to point you in that direction. However, the Fisher Queen is so mythical that it's hard to tie. However, that is tantalizing because we do have the floating city in the Cranogs, and then we have this other floating city here. So maybe this is a kind of Children of the Forest water magic remnant, but it's you know, you're going way back into the, like, as deep as you can go into this history. You know, this isn't a real world. This history is, it's supposed to look deeper than it really is. George is trying to imply all kinds of deeper stories that he hasn't actually written because he's not a Tolkien-like writer. So this is about the depth of the world there when you get to that. I'm not sure if we can link those floating cities or not, because there's really nothing else in common with the Cranog men and anything we find out here. The only link is potentially the Ifuk-Hebron. You're talking about Teotihuacan, Espalier. And yeah, they did a lot of hydroponic farming out onto the lake. Most of the city was built out onto the lake. It was floating but not moving. So perhaps that's the reality here. Maybe the memory of the Fisher Queen city is, oh, it moved around the Silver Sea. It was a floating palace. Well, maybe it didn't move. Maybe it was really just built out onto the water. Tenochtitlan. Did I say Teotihuacan? That's different. Yeah, sorry. Tenochtitlan is what I'm talking about. Cool. Thank you. I always get those two confused. Bad knowledge, Dave. Bad knowledge. All right, cool, guys. Well, looks like that's it for the questions, so I will go ahead and wrap it up there. Unless, like I said, you want to slip one in here at the very last second, but I've covered a lot of material today. So thanks for coming out. And remember, you can boost the stream by, as soon as it's over, hitting refresh and leaving a comment. So that is what I would appreciate. If you enjoy what I'm doing here and you want me to keep doing it, show of appreciation, hit the refresh, leave a comment, press like, and I'll see you on Sunday. I'm not sure. Actually, no, not Sunday. Monday. Sunday is the 49ers playoff game. Gonna have to watch that. And 2 weeks after that's the Super Bowl. Also going to move that one to a Monday. So let's just say the next 3 weeks are probably going to be Mondays for that reason. So there you go. So I will see you next Monday, not Sunday, but the same time, 3 p.m. Pacific. All right, guys. Remember to leave a comment on the way out, and I'll see you next time.